Good morning once again, and welcome to the National Racial Equity Initiative Community Conversation here in Detroit. To begin today's program, welcome poet Tawana Petty, performing two pieces, Dear Detroit and Hydration.
Welcome to Detroit. Yes, born and raised here. Thank you for having me. And so when we think about public safety, there's so many aspects of public safety. And so I want to do two poems for you, the first one being about water, and the second one just being my love letter to Detroit. And excuse me, I hail from a city where the water is off, 45 from Flintstones where they picking us off. They thought they had us cornered, but they pissed us off. Now we done come together, who would have thought? I witnessed her soul slither violently away from her body. Denial pursed tightly upon her lips. She fixed her face to tell me she wasn't thirsty, that her babies weren't 30 days away from being ripped from her custody. I could sense deception in her teardrops. She was lying to me about water, fibbing to keep her babies near. She almost let me leave them waterless. And I wanted to hug her, but I knew that her pride was the only ounce of protection she had left to muster, barely hanging on as if the Reaper had granted her another chance if she could just pull herself together. Why do folks gotta beg for water, hiding behind scarlet letters spray painted to mark their negligence? I wondered what she thought of me, standing there with the fate of her family stuffed inside my trunk. I left 3 gallons of water and walked away. There'd be 10 more mothers for me to hydrate that day. I hail from a city where the water is off, 45 from Flintstones where they picking us off. They thought they had us cornered, but they pissed us off. Now we done come together, who would have thought? Thank y'all. Safety, public safety means having what you need, having the resources you need, addressing quality of life issues. And the second poem is a love letter to Detroit. We were supposed to turn our backs on you, count down to your imminent demise, dangle you by the limbs of misdeeds. They wanted us to rate you inferior. Plagued by deteriorating neighborhoods and a convoluted history, you were never supposed to bloom from your ashes. A lot like you have been discarded like debris, deemed useless to naysayers and convictors, yet you keep rising, clinging to vitality. You refuse to allow statistics to dictate your destiny, and the media will channel your journey. And though some shall remain loyal, others will mock your tribulations. You were combing a young into maturity. Both your gift and your curse, imported from adversity. You've seen better decades, yet you thrive during the worst of them. Your best days have yet to arrive, and though some won't stick around to witness your climb or rejoice in your restoration, your destination is inevitable. You've been on the bottom much longer than most, and the bridges you'll journey won't be easy to coast, but you will make it. And bring warriors with you, armed with devotion. They will defend your dignity and honor your namesake. You are Detroit, the road to progression, the mirror image of endurance, and you hold the key to taking back our democracy. Thank y'all.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, Nicole Austin Hillary.
Good morning, good morning. I am Nicole Austin Hillary, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the president and CEO of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, Incorporated. But before I go on, can we please take another moment to recognize and thank Tawana for that amazing poetry and spoken word. Thank you. Tawana, that was the perfect opening because we are here today because this is about democracy. And I'm so glad you used that word. We are here today because we want to be on the ground in Detroit with you all in community, to talk about real issues, to talk about how we make our communities better, how we empower the people in our communities, and how we put ourselves in position to be in charge of our own destiny. That's what democracy is about, Tawana, and thank you for reminding us of that. For those of you who are not familiar with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, let me just take a few minutes to tell you about who we are and what we do. We are a not-for-profit organization founded in 1976, and we were founded to focus on 3 key areas. That was about building leadership in the Black community, educating the Black community, and ensuring that we have intellectual research and tools so that our communities have the information and resources they need to do the work that they need to do around ensuring that we can be in charge of our own destiny. Our Leadership Institute ensures that we have a pipeline of new Black leaders coming into the nation so that we can continue this work and grow and develop how we strengthen our own communities. Now, I know many of you are familiar with the Congressional Black Caucus, and you are going to hear from one of our phenomenal members shortly. But I want to make sure you all know about the foundation and know that we are here to be with you in partnership and in community. And I really want to focus on that word community today because it's crucial. For so many people, they don't necessarily understand that community is about building bridges, and it's about telling our own stories and building on our own stories. I have a personal and particularly prescient story, which is why I'm here at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I grew up in a community that was nourished and built by working class people, people who loved their children, loved their neighborhood, but who were often misjudged. I don't know about any of you, I am a PK. For those of you who are children of ministers, that's not what I mean. I'm a project kid. So yeah, yay for the project kids. And for me, knowing that I had a nurturing community, knowing that I had a community where we believed in success, even when other people didn't believe in our success, that made a difference for me. That made a difference to my friend Eric across the street, who grew up to become a doctor. It made a difference for me, who grew up to become a lawyer, even though there were people who doubted us, doubted what we could do, and doubted the strength of our communities. That's why we are here in Detroit today, because we at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation do not doubt the power of community. We do not doubt the power that you all have to create change and to make your communities work for you and on your behalf. So we're going to have a conversation today about public safety. We know that public safety is at the heart of what makes us feel whole and what makes us feel confident in our own neighborhoods. And so we're going to have real conversation today. We're going to roll up our sleeves. I know I have on a nice suit and pearls, but trust me, y'all, I'm going to roll up these sleeves later today. We're going to be around tables, and we are going to talk about solutions. We are not going to walk out of this space today without having some real roadmaps in place for how we can bring about change here in Detroit. And again, we are not here to tell the community what to do. We are here to stand next to you, stand beside you, and support you in what you need to do. That's the real conversation we're going to have today, and that's how we're going to ensure, Tawana, that democracy is working for everyone. So before I introduce our next guest, I want to just remind you that being here in Detroit is not the only thing that you will see the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation do. You are going to see us throughout the year having different events that you can be engaged in, whether we're here in Detroit or whether you can engage with us virtually. So I want you to take note of this. On May 12th, we will have a Policy for the People Virtual Health Equity Summit, because we know that health disparities are real in our communities, particularly after we have lived through this pandemic and are still living through this pandemic. We have seen disparities rear their ugly heads, and we need to look at what that means for what kinds of systems we need to put in place to better protect the community. I want you to also make sure you follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we are on LinkedIn. That's how you can stay up on what we're doing, and we encourage you to, again, stand with us, stand next to us, and be engaged. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce a trailblazer, someone who is not a stranger to you all here in the Detroit community. She is someone who is working in Washington on your behalf every day. Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence served as the previous mayor of the city of Southfield and as the first Black person and first woman to serve in that position. In addition, she previously served on the Southfield City Council, where she was elected president in 1999. Now she represents the great state of Michigan's 14th Congressional District, which includes a portion of Detroit, the city of Southfield, and 16 other cities in Oakland and Wayne counties. And she is also, y'all, she's bad, she is also second vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. So without further ado, please help me welcome to the stage the formidable Congresswoman Brenda L. Lawrence.
I want to say good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. And I want to thank Nicole for her wonderful introduction and her hard work. Good morning, Detroit. I'm home, and it's always good to be home. I wouldn't miss this opportunity to be here in the Motor City for any time people come together to make a change. I'm excited about the CBCF community, this conversation we're having in Detroit to discuss making public policy. As always, I want to be part of the solution and to make sure that the issues that are directly impacting Black America are not pushed to the side. It is always powerful when Black people in America come together to highlight what's working and what's not working, and to celebrate each other and our culture. And it's always a good time to be home with my community in Michigan fighting for justice. You know, I like to tell people I'm the little Black girl from the east side of Detroit. And I say that with honor, and I say that with a little bit of attitude. Because in Detroit, we don't lay down for anyone. We stand up and we fight. We've been through some of the most horrific cases of our government failing us, our government being blind to us, and our government being woke up by us. We are such an amazing community. So often things happen in America, and if you look at the history, when there was oppression, there was no infrastructure to embrace us. The Congressional Black Caucus and the foundation has continuously pushed us forward, united us, and gave us a platform to have a louder voice and to fight against racism, segregation, and civil rights attacks that have occurred. But now that you look at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, you can see the Black Youth First being amazingly opportunities that they're given and to see their light shine on Capitol Hill. As our CBC members like myself, we give them opportunities in our office. You can look at the scholarships, the fellowships, and overall advocacy and see how our collective effort have helped change a global Black community. But our fight isn't over. We must energize people through forums like these and connect them to issues so that we can all work together to make real change. Of course, I stay connected with what happens in Detroit. It's my oath and it's my job, and the great state of Michigan. I just came home yesterday evening from the homegoing service of that amazing young man whose life was taken by a police officer because of a traffic stop. Shot in the back of his head while being held down on the ground. We celebrate during Black History those who came before us and made change. But we're on the clock now, and there's so much we need to address and so much work we need to do. It's disappointing to see the statistics of the study shared by USA Today in 2021. And some of the old folks you saw say, it makes my heart hurt to see that 1 in 5 residents cited public safety as the biggest issue they face in their city, second to education. I never want anyone to feel that way, especially my people and especially from my city of Detroit. But we also can't allow ourselves to be distracted from our job and our obligation and duty to make a difference for the next generation, so that generations to come will say, when we were on the clock, we made a difference, and we made it different for the next generation. I want you to know that this time in America, that we have so many issues. It's hard to sleep at night when you know it's your responsibility to make a difference. I want you to know, while I'm not running for re-election, I will not ever forget or walk away from the challenge of being a Black woman in America, of having the responsibility to continue in some form to have my voice heard, to stand up when everyone else is being silent. I know when I sit in Congress and people are talking about issues like health care, and they make a general statement, yeah, women die from childbirth. And I'm sitting there looking around the room, as often the only Black person still in the room, and I'll say, but do you know Black women are dying at a higher rate? What are we gonna do about that? Do you know that our children are performing at a lower rate? Do you know that our Black women are carrying the majority of student debt in America? Do you know, when it comes to breast cancer and poverty, our people are suffering at a higher rate? So it is important now for us to speak up more than ever. Please allow me the privilege of introducing another CBC sister, most recently elected as the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus Board of Directors. That's my sister girl and my friend, Congresswoman Terry Sewell. She serves Alabama's 7th Congressional District as one of the first women elected to Congress from Alabama. She's so proud of that. And the first Black woman to ever serve the state of Alabama in Congress. In her short time in Congress, she has held several leadership positions and has been an outspoken advocate for honoring the sacrifices of our freedom fighters who have served as powerful agents of change. And I want to close with this. I love these United States of America. I love her even though she didn't always love me back. She didn't love me because I was a woman. She didn't love me because of the color of my skin. But from examples of leadership, of people standing up when there was wrong in this country, we were able to change things. We were able to create something called a Civil Rights Act in America that would make it illegal. We passed laws that allowed women to vote along with men, and we fought to get voting rights. But guess what? We're still fighting for that same fight in 2021. But I love these Americas because I know that when we stand up and fight, when we refuse to be silent, we can change things. And I believe in one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all of us. And all of us includes me as a little Black girl from the east side of Detroit. God bless you. And now I'll turn you over to Terry Sewell. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. I am thrilled to join so many community leaders from Michigan for a real conversation with NREI and CBCF on how we can make the Detroit community safer for Black residents. Thank you, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, for that gracious introduction and for being a sojourner in the fight for justice. As the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, I assure you we are unifying and focusing on uplifting and leading Black communities like Detroit forward. You will hear from some of the nation's most influential Black leaders and activists who continue to roll up their sleeves to fight for a more inclusive America by getting in good trouble. And as the late Congressman John Lewis would say, necessary trouble that creates progressive change, especially for Black people in our communities. It is with great pleasure that I introduce my good sister friend, Congresswoman Terry Sewell, a passionate champion for change, the civil rights mother of Selma, Alabama, her hometown, the only Black woman serving in the Alabama congressional delegation. She is our board chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, leading and advancing the global Black community by educating the public on public policy, developing young future leaders, and providing them scholarships. When we talk about phenomenal leadership, we think of Terry Sewell. When we talk about strong Black women, I think about Terry Sewell. So please join me in congratulating and welcoming my outstanding CBC sister, Congresswoman Terry Sewell.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for your gracious introduction. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here with you today and to be the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's newly elected board chair. Also, thank you to each person here today. Your participation is what makes the difference. We would also like to thank General Motors, our event sponsor, and the College for Creative Studies for welcoming us to their campus. For over 45 years, the CBCF has redefined what it means to make a difference in Black America. Most recently, the National Racial Equity Initiative created a task force comprised of 7 ambassadors that will work alongside CBCF to advance the critical mission of NREI and empower action-driven change. We thank them for joining the mission to drive social justice reform and challenge racial injustice. When I was in college, I interned with my member of Congress, and I can remember walking the halls of Congress and not seeing many women in any role, let alone elected officials. But now, I am one of 28 Black women of the Congressional Black Caucus, and we have our first Black female justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was confirmed earlier this month by our very first Black Vice President, Kamala Harris, while presiding over the final vote in the Senate. It was truly an historic moment for Black America. Although we've had some wins, we've also had some losses. It seems that old battles have become new again, as state legislatures across this nation are passing more restrictive voter laws. And recently, we felt a big defeat when the bill that I authored, the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, did not pass the Senate. We simply cannot sit back and continue to let this happen. We can't. We must not give up, because we understand that the price of freedom is not free, and that it has been bought and paid for by the blood and tears of our ancestors. Yes, we may face roadblocks in our quest to solve issues affecting the Black community, but it is not the end of the road. Let us continuously be renewed by the courage and unwavering faith of foot soldiers who marched 57 years ago through my hometown of Selma, Alabama, and gathered secretly and openly in rooms like these, committed to march until victory was won. I am honored to introduce our next two speakers, each woman being an example of how it can be done. These Black women leaders are intentionally creating and occupying the necessary space to raise their voices and uphold influential leadership positions that encourage, inspire, and support and lead the way for future generations. Now it is my pleasure to introduce my sister, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, who proudly serves Michigan's 14th Congressional District. She is a lover of the truth and has been serving and leading fiercely for over 30 years. Congresswoman Lawrence was also the previous mayor of the city of Southfield, serving as the first African American and the first woman to ever serve in that position. Additionally, she sat on the Southfield Public School Board of Education, where she served as the president, vice president, and secretary. Who better to be on this panel than a fellow Michigan leader? Thank you, Congresswoman Lawrence, for joining us today. Next, I'd like to introduce the moderator of our fireside chat, CBCF's newly elected president and CEO, Nicole Austin Hillary. Nicole has been a longtime advocate for addressing and combating systemic racism, improving the U.S. immigration system, and tackling the problems within the domestic criminal justice system. She has also dedicated her life's work to advocating for policies to address poverty and inequity. Prior to her start with the foundation, Nicole was the executive director of the U.S. program at Human Rights Watch and the first director and counsel of the Brennan Center's Washington, D.C. office. She opened it in March of 2008. These two women will explore Congresswoman Lawrence's 30 years in elected public service and how legislators and community members can work together to reform public safety. It is my honor and my privilege to welcome Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence and CBCF's President and CEO, Nicole Austin Hillary.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Congresswoman Lawrence, for being here with us today. We promised everyone we were going to have real conversation, so
Yes.
Let's get started with that.
Okay.
You have been a civic and governmental leader for a long time.
Yes.
You have been in the trenches. Tell us what it means, based on those years of experience, what it means when we talk about public safety. It's a term we hear, but that means something different to different people, and I think also it means something different depending on the communities that you are from. Tell us what that means and how you have seen the discussions around public safety change over the years.
Well, I want you to know, being on the school board, one of our responsibilities was to make sure that the children were safely transported back and forth to school, and once they were in the building, that they were protected and that they were getting the resources to be safe. As a mayor of a city, it expanded to every member of the community. And so a few people know that as a mayor, I sat at night by my bed was the dispatch radio, where I could hear the conversations of the police when runs were called in. I don't know if every mayor does that, but that's what I did. And normally, it was just kind of filtered noise, but when you hear the activity ramp up and there's multiple calls, then you would pay attention. Every time there was an arrest, I got a report from the police department. So let me talk about what public safety meant to me. Because if there was a citizen who felt they were not properly given their justice during a point of contact with our police, I received each of those. So I'm really disappointed when I hear about historic, just repeated incidents of failure of our police, and everyone act as if they didn't know about it. Because there's no way you can be a mayor of a city and not have a grasp on how your constituents feel about their police. So a couple things. I was proud to be one of the first cities to start activating tasers in my police department. And why is that? Because if you have, and I had a case in front of me where a person did what you call death by cop. A person will intentionally aggravate or just really engage with the police to a point where it becomes confrontational. Without tasers, the only recourse were the guns that we issued to police. It's there as a point because it's one man. He charged the police with the knife. He was mentally ill. He wasn't a criminal. He was mentally ill. The police had to defend themselves, and he did it in a public place. He could have very easily started slashing and cutting public citizens. But with a taser, you could actually bring this person to a point temporarily so that you could apprehend and disarm him. So that was something that was important to me. The other thing was getting body cams. I sit on appropriations. I have just approved funding directly for the city of Oak Park. I'm going to do it for the city of Detroit, where we will buy with federal dollars body cams. Why am I so passionate about body cams? It protects the citizen and it protects my law enforcement. I'm not one of those people who will say defund the police. That's not my lane. Because when you call 911, if you're in danger, I want a trained, professional law enforcement person to respond to you. And I will hold that person accountable. One area of accountability are the body cams. And so I was very passionate about that. The last thing I'm going to say, you cannot hire a police officer as a rookie and give them the designated training and never train them again over their 30-year career and expect them to be in compliance. Training for police should be ongoing. It should be mandatory training, because one of the jobs I had when I worked for the Postal Service, I was a manager of training and development. And the one thing that we did before you could fire someone, I was an EO investigator at one time too, federal EO investigator. I would always ask, what training have you given this person? You can't hold someone accountable if you as an organization haven't clearly defined the expectations for that employee. So I really wanted to do those three things: the body cams, the tasers, and regular training for accountability.
I'm so glad that you mentioned all of those things. You've given us a lot to unpack here, so let's do that. You know, when community members hear anecdotes like the one you just shared, they hear these things and they often say, you know, the solution to that is simple. We need to train officers. We need to provide mental health support so that there are alternatives available in the community. And you know, Congresswoman Lawrence, I've worked on criminal justice issues for years, so these are the conversations that I've been engaged in. But it's not necessarily as simple as that, is it? Can you talk to us a little bit about what kinds of barriers are actually in place when local lawmakers and lawmakers at your level have to really try to implement real reform? It's not necessarily as simple as seeing something and identifying, well, this is what we need, and then quickly putting it in place. What are some of those barriers?
To me, the biggest barrier is the lack of accountability. When you see an officer, or you receive a complaint, that's usually how it happens, you receive a complaint and nothing is done about it because of relationships, because of status. Well, we're going to look the other way. Well, when you look the other way, you're giving permission for another police officer to behave the same way. What was so egregious to me, and few people talked about the George Floyd situation, that officer was literally training new officers. When he sat there with his knee on the neck of George Floyd. Now, if the cameras and all of the reveal that happened, what was sent to that new police officer? Well, when I can put my knee on the neck of somebody and hold them down. That's what I'm supposed to do. A senior officer trained me that way. But that is the biggest issue for me, is accountability. And there should be consequences. The mental health piece. You know, police officers aren't magical. They're human beings with prejudice, with all kind of issues. Things change in their lives. Most of them are military. What do you do in the military? You train people to go out and you have the enemy. If I define my enemy as young black men, so when I put on my badge and go out, I'm seeking the enemy. Where's the mental health piece? Where's that training in diversity and inclusion? You know, Trayvon, what was so bad about him? He put a hood on. In somebody's mind, if you're a black man walking around with a hood on, you're a thug, you're the enemy, you're gonna commit a crime. We have to just head on and have the political courage to do it. One thing I wanna mention, because my responsibility in Congress now, I just introduced the Oath Act. And what it requires is every police department to take body cam footage and train their officers. So every month, you got to pull some tape of a situation and include that into the training or the briefing that you have with police. How did that police officer handle it? You have an opportunity to know what your police are doing. If you're using the body cam, use that film to train, hopefully correct bad behavior, or push you as leadership to say we need to address this because this is going to lead to something that we don't want to happen.
You know, as you talk about the training, I can't help but think about the training of the mind. And we heard our CBC leader, Congressman Beatty, just invoke the name of the late, great John Lewis.
Yes.
And we know that Mr. Lewis, as he taught so many of us, often focused on changing hearts and minds. So when we talk about the kinds of trainings that police officers need, that's about action. That's about the specific tools and tactics they use to do their jobs. But do we have an obligation to also try to reach a training of the mind and changing of the mindset and the heart the way Congressman Lewis invoked us to do? And does that need to be a part of the formula for how we reform public safety?
You know, I'm going to use a life experience. When I was an EO investigator, I had a complaint of discrimination. And so when I walked into the office and I had my scheduled meeting with this manager, he looked at me, he was a white male, he said, you know, I don't like your kind. And he said, I don't care what you come here today to talk to me about. There's nothing you can do to make me like your people. And I just looked at him and smiled, and I folded up my folder and I looked him in the eye and I said, sir, you're absolutely right. There's nothing I can do to make you like me. But what I can do is say, you will not get another check from this company as long as you feel this way and you have your feelings impact the work environment of people of my kind. Now, I can walk out of this room now, or we can have a conversation if you want to continue to work here. And, you know, I love John Lewis, and thank God we have people who love and teach love, but sometimes you have to attack issues with consequences. And, you know, it's like, yes, I want you to love me, but I'm gonna demand that you respect me and treat me fairly. And I used to tell people all the time, I really don't care if you like me. You know, I go home to get love, but I come to work to do a job.
Exactly.
And earn love.
And maybe what we're really saying here is it needs to be a bifurcated strategy.
Yes.
That we don't have to leave the teachings of Mr. Lewis to the side, but that we need to
Yes.
in modern day times, combine that with real action that is going to change the outcomes for people.
Keep hope alive.
Exactly, exactly. You know, a lot of people, when they talk about these issues, Congresswoman, they don't necessarily understand what the various vehicles are within their local legislatures, within their local city council offices, township offices. Can you help people to understand, you know, how do the levers of power work? How, you know, who are the stakeholders and the players that are really engaged in creating public safety mechanisms and laws?
So if I can start from the federal level. So my job is to send the funding, resources, and make laws that will give you the overall expectation of democracy in this country. What happens, and you know, I like to use Terry Sewell's situation. She lives in Alabama, and their interpretation of what fairness and laws are a lot different than other places in the country. So to give you an example, if I pass a law that says every police force have to have body cams, right? Well, it goes down to local cities. And if I, as a police chief, say, I don't care if y'all turn them on or not, just put them on, then I'm in compliance. They always try to find that way to negotiate it. And that's why we're constantly writing bills and amending. So you say everybody has to have them, somewhere somebody got to say you got to turn them on. And it seems, but there is always opportunities to weave in and out. And I'm going to share this because it's so, I'm so upset right now. That officer who shot that man, Patrick, in the back of his head, has still not come to be interviewed. He has not reported. If you and I had shot someone in the toe with a gun, they would arrest me and bring me down to the station, and I had to respond immediately. The other thing that is really, really troubling me is that the excuses. So they said, well, if you're a police officer, I don't know where this law came from, you have 72 hours before you respond to an investigation because you're stressed out. You're stressed out. Somebody's dead. A family is grieving. You're stressed out. And then he gave the excuse that my attorney is on vacation, so I cannot give a statement until my attorney come back from vacation. Let us say my attorney's on vacation. I'd be sitting in a county jail waiting for my attorney to come back. But it's all these little loopholes, and people spend careers finding loopholes. And so the accountability comes from us. You know that I'm sitting there now trying to figure out how to write a bill that says police officers must respond to investigations just like our criminal laws apply to other people. If George Floyd had passed, why do you think they didn't pass it in the Senate? It had passed, they would not be treated differently than a citizen who was involved in a shooting. Obviously, he's a police officer. We legally give him a gun. So that is a given. He was involved in a traffic stop. We understand that. There's certain things we have to filter through. But you took your gun and you killed a person. You got to answer to that. And that's part of George Floyd. And so, you know, John Lewis, bring him back up, he said, why do you think they, you know, because that was the major, amazing experience for me to sit on the floor and sit next to John Lewis and have him to teach and mentor me. He said, Brenda, because he would just come up with stuff. He said, Brenda, why do you think they fight so hard to stop us from voting? Why do you think they just come up with ways constantly to stop us from voting? Because they know if we as a people go to the polls, we stop them from oppressing us. We bring power. It's so much power in our vote. And that's why they use these social media platforms to tell people, oh, don't vote. They don't care about you. It doesn't matter. You're just one person. He said they want us to believe that because when we don't vote, we give them our power to them. And so I just can't tell you how important it is, these laws. Pay attention to them. Be just righteously upset when they do not pass the laws that benefit our quality of life.
When we talk about these laws, one of the problems is, and this was a problem I dealt with for years as someone working on these issues, is that they're different everywhere. And you mentioned that when you said you don't know where this 72-hour rule comes from. That's part of what frustrates community members. Because if I'm from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The laws in my jurisdiction may be different than what they are in Michigan, than what they are in California. And that's part of what frustrates, I think, community members. They can't look and say, okay, here is a rule that applies to everyone. Is that what Congress can help provide the community in working on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and other similar bills? Is that a way forward, helping to level the playing field so that individuals can have certain expectations and know that they will be met no matter what part of this great country they live in?
So I want everyone to know part of our democracy is that every state, every city can pass laws. So if, like the body cams, there's some cities who will not use body cams. That's their policy. We don't believe in it. Once we pass a bill that says every city can get a body cam, they can say, you're not gonna make me do it. Then we can say, well, if you don't want to use it, you will not get another federal dollar. We will stop any city that refuses to use body cams will not get any federal funding. But that's why so often we just pay attention to national politics, and they are knocking you in the face every day on a local level with local laws and policy. You have to pay attention to every level. Your city. We debate things like, can you have a Rottweiler or a pit bull unrestrained in a city? I mean, and the community turns out, because people have different perceptions of dogs, but if you're allowed to have a dog that has attacked other people and there's no laws or rules, but pay attention to your local, your state, your county laws, because we as a federal government, we have umbrella laws. We have the Constitution. No one can change the Constitution. Civil rights laws, no one can violate them. Even if you have a local policy, it's all right if I slap you in the face, so what? No, that's against federal law. So you have to stay on us. And some people love to stay on the hill. Well, they're kicking your butt at home. Pay attention to what they're doing to you at home. And so I want you all to know that every level of government, we can institute law that will impact local governments. That's why the George Floyd voting rights, it addresses those communities. They went in, was it Georgia or North Carolina? They closed down all the voting precincts in the poor and black communities and moved everything to the more affluent, rich community.
That was Georgia.
That was Georgia. Now, what does that mean? If I'm poor, I'm a senior citizen, I don't have a car, and it's time for me to vote, I don't have a way to get to the voting poll. They said, we didn't stop anybody from voting, they can still vote. Well, guess what? When you have a true plan for voting, a person can get to it conveniently, if it's on bike, walk, however. But what's the chances of me getting 30 miles away to get to a voting center? But if I'm rich and in a mostly white community, I can walk out my door and go vote. Those are the things when I talk about local government. But the George Floyd Act, we heard about that, and that, and I'm sorry, not George, I said Voting Rights Act, would address that no community, local, can start dismantling the infrastructure of voting in a community without it being under a review and it being reported to the Department of Justice.
Now, you started the checklist. I promised everyone we were not going to leave here with just, nice speeches.
Okay.
We're going to leave here with action items. You've already given them one, Congresswoman Lewis, Congresswoman Lawrence. One is know what's happening in at the local level. Okay, get engaged. What are two other things we want to leave community members with in terms of what they can do with respect to their own power and opportunities?
So we all know that social justice, criminal justice, education of our children is one of those things. What did they do when they enslaved us? They destroyed our families, ripped us apart. They denied us employment. They denied us education. And they denied us the right to own property. So I want you to think about that. If I'm not educated, I'm not going to get a good job. If I don't get a good job, I'm not going to be able to start generational wealth by owning a home. Right now, home ownership for Black people in America is plummeting. We are going to have to pay attention to those things that are generational. Generational is education. If our schools are not functioning, pay attention to that. Your baby may have graduated from Harvard, Yale, and you doing a happy dance at graduation, but that other child who didn't have the resources or the parents didn't have the vision, that child is not going to be able to obtain their right and their privilege. So think about housing. We are the largest spending base, and cannabis, gambling. I talked to some young people. I know that cannabis is legal, that train has left the station. But why you gotta walk in a grocery store and I get a contact just because you walk by? Why do I have to, they had a day in Detroit where everybody smoked weed, right? And
421.
Yes, and you could see these individuals just sluggish and, I feel so good. When you're feeling that good, you're not at your best. Anything that stops you from being your raw best, is it consumption that important? Because this crap about I need marijuana because I got arthritis. You don't have to smoke it. You can rub it on your knee. I can't sleep at night, so I have to smoke a joint. No, take a gummy or drink some tea. We don't have to I'm just digressing. I just have an issue with that. But
go on.
Pay attention to our ability to be educated. Never stop. If you see this little kid and he's just hanging out, this thing about can a baby read? Some of us are retired or have some time on our hands. Go to a local school and just read to children. They'll welcome you in. If we as a people become better educated, it empowers all of us. The last thing I want to talk about is the housing and our economics. I have watched, and I'm particularly sensitive to women, carrying around a $3,000 bag and don't have 2 cents in the bank. Don't own one stock, but I look darn good. I paid $400 for my weave and got my nails done, and my toes are real pretty, and have no wealth. You know what makes you good? Make you look real good? Is when you got money in the bank and you have a good credit rating. I can buy anything I want. But we have become a society, especially our young folks, who concentrate so much on this outer part that we forget about the brain and we forget about the pocket. So I just want you to lift your voices and make sure that we are generationally impacting our people in our community.
Congresswoman Lawrence, first of all, I feel like we should pass the plate, but we won't. That's first. But secondly, Thank you. You've given us so much to focus on. And we're gonna, when we have these table talks, everybody, we're gonna be following up on some of these very things that you have put out here for us. I am so saddened that you are leaving Congress, but we know we're gonna still have you in the community. And we have something very special for you right now because we didn't want you to get out of here without letting you know how much we have valued your leadership and clearly your wisdom and your marching orders. So we just want you to know that we want to give you some flowers to thank you for your leadership, thank you for being an example to all of us, and to please keep on teaching, mentoring, and leading even in the next chapter of your incredible life. So from us to you.
Thank you. I just want you all to know, first of all, I'm so glad I'm alive to smell these roses. My passion is that I have a legacy, that what I do and say will be spoken generations later. And lastly, I couldn't be here without you. I would not be able to sit in rooms to carry your voice without your support. God bless you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Brenda Lawrence and Nicole Austin Hillary. We'll return after a short 5-minute break for our first moderated discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our first panel, please welcome to the stage the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Partnerships at General Motors, Reginald Humphrey.
All right. Good morning, Detroit. Oh, no. See, I go to church at New Providence Baptist Church under Dr. Everett and Jennings Sr., and whether it's 5 people in the congregation or 5,000, we're going to give love, appreciation, right, reverence to what's going on here today. So good morning, Detroit. Good morning. All right, now I feel a little bit more love. All right, so first and foremost, I just want to thank the leadership team from the CBCF and our National Racial Equity Initiative for Social Justice. This is an amazing day, and not only from a climate perspective, but the time is now. I want to make sure that this Detroit conversation, I know it's going to be very authentic. It's going to be very meaningful. So for those who didn't show up, for those who didn't show out, just make sure that they understand the impact of today and what we have to carry on in the future. So I really appreciated Congresswoman Lawrence and our CBCF President and CEO Nicole Austin Hillary's comments in the fireside chat. We were left with our checklist. And those of you who were ready to do your homework, right, it was all about making sure that we know what's happening in our local community, that we understand the importance of home ownership, the access to a quality education, and good economic stewardship is how I framed it up. So let's make sure we do our part leaving this moment today. So on behalf of General Motors, I have a great and powerful and empowering leader in Mary Barra, our chair and CEO. My direct leader is the Chief of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Telva Magruder. And again, I'm Reggie Humphrey, and I'm just glad to be here today. I want to make sure that I show appreciation for not only the partnership that we've created with CBCF, But most of that, and I'll put that squarely on the shoulders of one of our biggest and brightest talents, Madam Rhonda Fields, who is here to my left and your right. Rhonda leads our Justice and Inclusion Fund, and we have made a commitment in excess of $20 million only in the first 2 years of its inception to really give towards nonprofits with a very specific philanthropic approach to address the societal inequities that are impacting our communities the most. Rhonda came in right away and built out a strategy that was based on 4 key pillars of health, education, economic opportunities, and policy. And you heard all of those embraced by our fireside chat today. So I'm really proud of how we've developed not only the partnership, but the relationship that we continue to grow in this space. When we think about those 4 pillars and our obligation to increase representation on Capitol Hill and in our local political communities, when we think about making sure that we're decreasing the barriers and ensuring equitable access to things like voting, these are the things that our Justice and Inclusion Fund are not only driving, but with partnership with the CBCF, specifically our fellowship program, it's to make sure that our voice is heard and that there's actionable intelligence being executed in our community. Detroit is not just our headquarters, it's our home. And so when we think about our journey towards an all-electric future and autonomous vehicles, what good is that if we're not making sure that Black and brown communities are safe and in a sustainable fashion? So our commitment to the community and beyond is to make sure that just as we want our customers, our dealers, our suppliers, our employees, we need this entire ecosystem to feel safe. That's the reason why we partner with organizations like CBCF to have authentic conversations like today. Ensuring the safety of all of these folks and having authentic conversations and events like this is what's going to lead to a better world, one community at a time. And you've done your part because you showed up. Now we're going to let this panel show out. So I'm excited to hear from this Power Pack group. I heard them talking in the back. A lot of authentic conversations are going to be had. I have the privilege of being able to introduce our moderator. Ilea Harvey Quinn is Executive Director of Force Detroit. And I know that this session is going to explore public safety from many different dimensions. And our hope is that you walk away with a better understanding of the various lived experiences and the historical implications of public safety right here in Detroit. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy. What my pastor always says is don't waste my wisdom. And I guarantee you that this particular panel is going to drop a lot of knowledge and a lot of nuggets that you can take home with you so we can make a better community for all. Thank you very much. God bless you. Y'all have a great day.
So first of all, I want to thank you all for offering me an opportunity to share some of my perspectives and to ask my esteemed colleagues some really provocative questions. I'd like to ground this conversation in the idea that doing this work, the work of rethinking public safety systems for Black people, is rooted in ancestral work, and it is rooted in a liberatory struggle that we have not dropped since our ancestors made it to America. I want to say how privileged I am to be in a position to lead an organization in Detroit to where I get paid and can support my family every day to think about issues of liberation, to think about issues of freedom, to think about how to create a freer and safer city, and to create solutions with my community that are generative. So I'm Ilea Harvey Quinn. I'm the Executive Director of Force Detroit. I started my work in Detroit as a poet, educator, and quickly found out that I wasn't bringing my best self to my work, and that I quickly ended up in scenarios where I was working with young people in some of our hardest hit neighborhoods that needed more support, and the tools that I had to offer them didn't meet their needs. They were being chased to our center from their schools by the police regularly. They were engaged in, some of them, outright gun violence. They were orienting themselves towards high-risk groups, And, you know, I ended up sitting here in this chair today because I chose to do something about it and to build a different type of vehicle. I also want to talk a little bit about the historical context of Detroit, starting from the population boom of the 1950s. And most of the information that I'm sharing with you is from the book called Origins of the Urban Crisis by Segru. So we know a lot about black violence, about gun violence, about what we call riots in Detroit, but we don't understand that there was a history of restrictive covenants, of white-led housing associations that literally were violent against black people when they moved into their neighborhoods. And this led to outright conflict in our streets, right? This led to stress, enforcing disparate policing in our communities, and all of these historical stories about DPD in that era, the 70s, that were painful. I also want to say, like, Coleman Young came to rise, and then as he came to rise, there was an economic flight. And I will say white flight, but I think it's important to note that there was an economic flight from our city, right? And Detroit became a space where there were a lot of black people with very, very few resources, very few grocery stores, very few places where they could get their needs met in really high quality ways. At some point in our city's history, this idea of stress reimagined itself in our own people, right? And so you have this like legacy of over-policing in the 1990s that manifests at its peak in a cop named Eugene Moore. He was known for over-policing and outright killing young black men, and he worked in what we now call the Cody Rouge neighborhood. This and other infractions led to consent decrees being placed on Detroit and a wave of really, really proactive community policing where the police were working to build relationships with community leaders and shifting the narrative about DPD. So we stand in a really interesting place as we have this conversation because DPD is an engine for community organizing, and yet many of the officers still respond to our young people, particularly young black and brown men, with a heavy hand. So these issues are, you know, tough to navigate. I want to welcome my colleagues in on the stage at this point. Please introduce yourself and your work and share a little bit about your definition of public safety and the lens you're bringing to this conversation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Keefe. I currently serve as the Managing Policy Counsel at the Detroit Justice Center, which is a nonprofit focused on creating what we call just cities, cities free from the harm of mass incarceration and the harms of racial inequity. Prior to my current role, I worked at the Detroit Justice Center as a staff attorney representing individuals who are returning citizens, those who are charged with lower level misdemeanors, and also helping with family reunification efforts such as helping individuals regain custody of their children after periods of incarceration. So I come to this work not only as a native Detroiter, but as someone who's extremely passionate, not just about changing our criminal legal system, but about transforming what our belief about public safety looks like. And so to answer your question, public safety to me is often mischaracterized as policing. We think that it just means law enforcement. And what it truly means is an opportunity for our community members not only to survive in their community, but to thrive, to have access to healthy foods at grocery stores, to be able to walk down the street and feel safe on their block, to have access to great schools, to have not only education, but affordable opportunities for higher education, access, employment, healthcare. Those are all things that kind of round out the definition of public safety. And again, too often I think that these conversations just focus on one aspect of it, and it's bigger than that.
Awesome being here. Happy Saturday to everybody, and good afternoon. I think we're in almost noon. Good morning. I am Tolulope Shanui, a medical physician here in Detroit, emergency medicine physician that works at Detroit Medical Center, Sinai Grace Hospital, as well as Detroit Receiving Hospital. I was trained at Henry Ford Hospital here in Detroit as well. And so in addition to serving as an emergency medicine physician, I also serve as a director for a community violence intervention program, a health center community violence intervention program that's known as Detroit Life is Valuable Every Day, or DLive. And DLive was really, a response to the public health crisis of community violence. And even in the way that I frame that, it's really us looking at community violence through the lens of it being a health issue, a health crisis, one that has tremendous effects on the life and quality of life and health of not only young people that are impacted by it, but their families and their concentric circles of influence in the community. So community violence happens to be the leading cause of death here in the city of Detroit for young people ages 15 to 34. And so the place where community violence and health intersect gave life to the birth of DLive. And so that's the space that I operate in. And so with that, when I think about public safety, inevitably I'm gonna look at it through a health lens, right? And health, I think, has been summarized in a lot of ways, even though we're not always conflating those issues. When Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence was talking, when Aaron Keith was just talking, when you hear about issues such as employment, housing, built-in environments, and things of that nature, those are really comprising actually the majority of health, believe it or not, as opposed to physicians and my colleagues like myself. And I do think when we speak about public safety, I actually think that's more of a referendum on our structures, right? Actually physical and tangible structures that are in our society, as well as our systems, right? And so by structures, I mean the quality of our water, right? The quality and access of our food, our roads, our bridges, and things of that nature where people can actually be physically harmed by. And then I think the other place that we have to look at when you think about public safety and the appropriate relevant actors and agents in that space is our systems, right? Our school systems, how effective are they doing? Our health systems, how effective are they doing? How effective are our jails and prisons, right? The things that we have that exist in terms of doing what they're supposed to be doing. I'm sure that will come up as well as our mental health facilities and those institutions and systems. And so I think the onus is on those systems and structures, and we need to focus our attention on that when we talk about this issue of public safety as opposed to people. And when we talk about people, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think we look at people, when we talk about people and safety, that's where we have to start talking about their health measures and their quality of life and things of that nature.
So I love going after smart people because I don't have to talk as much. My name is Mike Rafferty, and I'm the president and CEO of an organization here in Detroit called New Detroit, which was formed in 1967 after our rebellion. Our mission is to achieve racial equity, racial understanding, and racial justice in Southeast Michigan. I came into this role 3 years ago and carrying more than a 50-year legacy with this idea that I have that I don't want my children to inherit racism, and that my parents should not have had to deal with it, and that we correct as much as we can so that our elders can go on to glory on their feet and with smiles on their faces and with justice served, right? Following, Aaron, I have to say that my definition is very similar. My definition of public safety is that people and property, particularly in spirits and hearts and minds, are not harmed in public space and allowed to thrive. And following other things that were said, it's really difficult to look at every statistical point and every human experience that we know of with Black and brown people in America and not acknowledge that racism is the issue, that it is systemic, that we're not going to solve any one point without acknowledging the need for holistic action, right? We can look at data points like Black women die at a rate 2.5 times that of white women during childbirth. We can look at numbers that came out of Rutgers University that said that Black men stand a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying at the hands of police when the number for men overall is 1 in 2,000. It's twice as much. The fact that a white family earns around 70 cents when a Black family earns, a Black family earns about 70 cents to every dollar. That's just income. When we talk about wealth, because Brendan Lawrence was talking about this earlier, it is important to think about saving money and that sort of thing. But historically, because of things like redlining and lack of access to opportunity, for every dollar that a white family has in wealth, a Black family has 7 cents, right? And all of these things come together as symptoms, almost like a rash is a symptom when you have cancer, right? Losing your hair is a symptom when you have cancer. We have to do chemotherapy, not provide an aspirin, right? And we think about public safety is sitting, the lack of public safety within communities of color, in my opinion, is sitting on racism, right? And each one of these things contribute to it. So with that.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate those really, really substantive answers to the definition of what public safety is. So that said, I would like each of you in reverse order to grade Detroit in terms of effectiveness and to answer the following question. When we attempt to measure the effectiveness of a city's public safety infrastructure, it can be daunting to properly consider all the factors. In your experience, what should Detroiters look to assess public safety infrastructure? And we want a clear-cut grade. Like, what do you give the city of Detroit?
As far as public safety is concerned?
Yes, sir.
I'd say a solid D, right? I look at this region, I look at the city as the focus, and I look at the region as the frame around it. And it's really easy to see how people in this region can thrive just by crossing 8 Mile, and going deeper into it, going deeper into the suburbs. Historically, some of the grandest wealth in this country has existed in this region, but you don't see it when you come south of 8 Mile, and you feel it. Not just in the city of Detroit, because I think that's it's important to acknowledge and examine the focus on the city of Detroit. But if I, as a person of color, a Black man, am going into a neighboring suburb, I don't feel comfortable. Yeah. And why is that? Some of the the areas surrounding Detroit have an extraordinary high number or a high, their budgets are based on fees and fines, which is almost an incentive for police officers to pull people over who, are neighbors to the city of Detroit. Racism doesn't have a boundary, and so I guess when I'm in answering the question, I would give. It's not just the city that I'm examining. It's the environment within which where we live, that includes Ferndale, Royal Oak, the Points, Grosse Points, and I think we have a long way to go before we acknowledge that there is harm done by coming out of your home and going into a public space, not just in the city of Detroit but surrounding.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, so so I'm in agreement. I think I heard a D.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, and I'm in agreement. I think that's a solid grade, right? And I think it's accurate. And I think it gives and inspires and opens up room for improvement, for our city, because we do have a ways to go. But the sobering truth is that when we evaluate and give this score, right, we have to account for everybody that's in the city, right? All classes, all jobs, all populations and things of that nature. And it's truly true that we are not thriving as a collective in this city. And I think that a lot of that is our city's unwell, our city's unhealthy, our city is sick. And when you look at, I mentioned earlier that I work at Sinai Grace Hospital, so that's in the northwest portion of or section of Detroit. And there's studies that have been done, ongoing studies that are being done here, as well as in other cities, that when you map out factors such as cardiovascular death, right, sudden cardiac death, and you put that on top of where people are getting their limbs amputated secondary to diabetes, and you put that on top of like medium household income levels, and violence and poverty and incarceration rates, it's no mystery and no wonder why all these things are clustered in the same area, right? And then you have a hospital there that's erected there to try to address these issues, right? And the hospital oftentimes, unfortunately, is a reflection and an amplification of these social ills and things that are going on outside of those hospital walls. And so if all those things are clustered together and they span issues such as employment and housing, and premature death, infant mortality, unemployment, young men being incarcerated at just ungodly rates, we know that we are not well, right? We know that we are not well. And I think it's important to take from this conversation this concept of these social determinants of health or psychosocial determinants of health. And those are where all these things that we've been talking about a little bit kind of fit into there, whether we're talking about the built-in environment, or issues such as transportation and quality housing. And not only naming those, but access to those. Who has access to those first? Who has access to economic mobility and, and appropriate paying jobs, and things along those lines. And so when I think about the indices or the indicators of a safe community and sort of like the measures that I'm looking at, that's what I'm looking at, right? I'm looking at how our youngest, most vulnerable people are doing, right? Our young people, infant mortality, how are their mothers doing? And looking at those measures, right? I'm looking at our young people and our adolescents. People should not be dying before the age of 30. That's crazy, right? That's crazy, right? I'm looking at preventable chronic health conditions, right? Things that are preventable. And the fact that they are preventable, but yet we still have them in far excess of other ethnicities in the city as well as other areas in the country, that is indicative of a failure of the systems and the structures that I talked about earlier. And so I think looking at those things, right, there's this concept called the allostatic load, which sort of looks at people's physiologic responses to stressors. Another term is like toxic stress. Finding measures of that, like in certain areas and zip codes, in the community or other indicators of how unwell we're doing. And I think when we are doing unwell, we're going to have an unsafe community, right? And so, bringing that health lens, I'm a firm believer that the healthier our community, the safer it will be. So.
Yeah, I absolutely echo that. That was so powerful. The health of our community is directly related to our public safety. And we see it. We see the trauma. We see how it manifests. And so I would agree with the other panelists in terms of giving public safety infrastructure writ large a D. But I'm going to go a step further with the metaphor. There are different types of students who get Ds, right? There are students who are struggling to grasp the material, and then there are students that don't pay attention and don't come to class, and they also get Ds. And I feel like, in my opinion, we fall into that latter group. When we look at what we would define as public safety and all the things that make a safe community, we're not investing in those things. To put it plainly, 1 out of every $3 from the city's general fund is spent on police. In summary, in fiscal year 2020, Detroit spent $317 million on the Detroit Police Department. from the city's general fund. And I want to directly compare that to the $22.5 million we spent on housing and the $12.7 million we spent on health during a pandemic. So when we look at why we're earning a D, it's because we're not prioritizing the right things. We're not investing our money in the things we know make communities safer. Restorative justice centers, trauma intervention programming, economic opportunities, actually getting money, dollars and cents into the hands of people who need the money. Looking at different things such as the child tax income credit, mental health and rehabilitation centers, living wage jobs. When we look at what the police are actually doing and where we're spending our money, half of all criminal prosecutions in Michigan are for minor traffic offenses like driving with a suspended license. Many of these offenses directly criminalize poverty and do nothing to improve public safety. In fact, driving without a valid license was the most serious charge at jail admission for 12% of Black men and 15% of Black women, compared to 6% for both white men and women, according to Pew. So I like to ground us in actual statistics because it's frustrating when we compare that to 41% being the DPD's average arrest rate for murder investigations, or 12% being the DPD's average arrest rate for rape investigations. If we put our money behind the things that actually make communities safer, we'd have a safer community. And so just to wrap it up, I think that, terms like defund the police and things like that, we allow them to become politicized. We allow that to become something that's radicalized. It's not a radical view to say, I don't necessarily agree that we should spend $1 out of every $3 to invest in something when there are bigger problems, when there are other areas that need our investment. That's not radical, it's common sense. And so that kind of informs my view of our grade for public safety.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I would also give the city of Detroit a D. I just would speak more to the things that were shared on this panel and looking at them as safety tools. So how do we make economic development a safety tool intentionally? How are we looking at economic development models that center most likely populations to be engaged in violence? How do we look at educational models that center the most directly impacted? How are we looking at these models and tying them and creating solutions that center those populations, that welcome those populations, and that improve systems to work for community hardest hit? So thank you for sharing. And you jumped ahead to our question about the budget. So during the fiscal year 2020, Detroit spent more money on the police department than any other department in the city. That number was $317 million. While defunding the police is often regarded as a controversial topic, what are your thoughts on Detroit's current spending on policing? So I wanted to open that question up to our other two panelists.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Erin Keith, and I think that just saluting the work that Erin and her team in Detroit Justice Center do. I think they have just a great grasp on that, right, on that area around the police budget and the appropriate areas of spending, right, in terms of how do we, because we have the statistics and we know that, in general, we cannot arrest our way out of an issue, right? We can't arrest our way out of a problem because those individuals have to return back home. And the families from which they were taken from are going to be going through and suffering the impacts of that, right? Whether it's the mom who loses her son to the criminal justice system and now all of a sudden her drinking kicks up, right? Or that young man's or that young woman's child is now without, a family member within the home, and that alters the trajectory in terms of like their life, right? In terms of like that adverse childhood experience that they're going to suffer as a result of a family member being incarcerated. And so that, to Erin's point, I think that the investment is misaligned. what's misaligned, and it has to sort of it has to be diverted to, if you will, the root causes, right? And the root causes that actually lead to people becoming, arrested and things of that nature, right? We have to sort of address those upstream factors that are leading to people having, being arrested for, driving without a license, or, whatever else it is that, we have people kind of sitting in, in jail for. So we just need to invest in these other sort of like areas that we've talked about, whether it be housing, employment, education.
Thank you for sharing.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I want to further that going through history. For those of you who haven't gotten to meet Jamon Jordan at the Black Scroll Network, I encourage you to look him up and get a history of Detroit through him. Through his tour, I learned that modern policing in the United States actually has roots here in the region and in Detroit. As slaves were fleeing the South and running away, they would often go through Detroit and get to Canada, and it was the militia that were formed to capture these slaves that is sort of the origin of how modern policing began. So when we think about that in relationship to what we're talking about today and public safety and how we have massive disparities and how much money is being spent on a system like this and how Black and brown Detroiters and Americans are disproportionately affected by this system, the system seems like it is working as it was designed. It seems that way, right? When we think about the amount of money that's being spent now, the amount of money spent on militarizing police is consistent with how it's been over decades, and I'll give another, bit of history. It's personal history. Erin and I were talking about when we grew up in Detroit. I'm a few decades ahead of her, and I came out of high school in the mid-'90s. When I came out of high school, there were more of us who were going to jail for graves than college, and I'm very blessed that I was one of the few going off to college, and it's. There's, it hurts to look back over the people I grew up with, having, not being able to celebrate with me the way that I'd like. And the amount of money spent then is comparable to the amount of money spent now. If the aim was public safety then, if the aim was public safety now, we would have made changes already. I don't think we've been, and to your point, these are there's the student who has the D who's not showing up for class. No corrective action really has been made for decades, if not centuries, on this. So to the real point about the amount of money, I would say, yes, we're spending entirely too much money. I say we have been spending entirely too much money. I think there are a lot of other things that, $317 million, or a third of the budget, can go toward that actually do create public safety and democratize public safety across the region.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Really, really glad that you spoke on the connection between policing and slavery, because I'm chomping at the bit to ask a few juicy questions. Anybody who studies whiteness will tell you that the concept of whiteness expands. And so there are populations that are included in the census as white that in years gone by would never have been included in the census as white, right? So we know a number of, I won't get into population, I don't want this question to sound biased. My question is, how does, in the Black community, that often takes the face of respectability politics. We try to present ourselves in a way that is upright, and we base our value on a picture-perfect depiction of ourselves in order to legitimize ourselves. And this conversation also plays out, maybe subconsciously, in discussions about criminal justice reform policy and in discussions about public safety policy. What answers or insights would you offer to this conundrum? How could we address this issue proactively in terms of designing policies that support our people, speak to the issues of our people without making them measure themselves against dominant white culture.
For me?
And anybody,
Who wants to
please.
start?
Sure, yeah. Sure, go.
I think simply one, Black is not monolithic, right? I think it's important to make sure that when we talk about inclusion, that when policies are being made, Black people writ large are involved in the policy, are involved in the policy making, are involved in the data, the lived experience of Black people or people, period. When policies are being made for them, they can't be excluded from the policy making. So I think that's a simple answer.
I can jump on that.
Sure.
And I hate to say it this plainly, but a suit and tie is not a bulletproof vest.
Right.
You're not absolved from experiencing poverty because you dress a certain way. You're not, you might still live in this community and not have access to clean food if you have perfect subject-verb agreement. You might go to a grocery store and smell like weed and still make more working in tech than someone who does everything right.
Yeah.
So I think we have to get away from that. Dr. King wore suits every day and they still killed him. Respectability politics is a myth. It doesn't actually help us get anywhere as a community. I think it's a distraction. I think it allows us to take our eyes off the real issues that are affecting our community, and instead of joining hands, we're pointing fingers. And it makes me feel sick when I think about it, because I grew up very privileged to even being from the city of Detroit, like within the city lines. I still had to recognize that I'm not dependent on the city bus to get from point A to point B, because both of my parents have cars. I walk to the corner store because I want to, not because I have no other way to access fruits and vegetables, or I'm depending on a bag of chips for my nutrients, or I'm going to school hungry. If you haven't experienced those things, and even if you have, and you have the bootstrap mentality, you're not in a position to speak to someone who is grappling with circumstances that you're not currently facing. And so I think we just need more compassion and more empathy when we look at people whose circumstances we may not agree with.
Yes, ma'am.
But I think to your question, just in terms of insights and the respectability politics and the history of whiteness and how that sort of like played out, just in terms of how we show up or try to show up to spaces. I think it highlights the importance of investing and lifting up our cultural institutions that are within the city that actually lift up our history, right, and speak to the history. And we were talking in the back about, and you mentioned it earlier when you opened up, about the stress program, right, with the police program, and the history of redlining, in our community, and how divestment has sort of like led to the present day issues that we have, and how that all goes back to two histories of racism. And we talk about Jim Crow era and these iterations of these things where, school to prison pipeline and all these things, like we have to keep those conversations in the forefront. We have to highlight and invest in our cultural centers where they're talking about that, whether it's in New Detroit or Force Detroit, Charles H. Wright, Nandy's, the bookstore and things of that nature, right? We gotta highlight those spaces and make those connections for our young people, as well as our elders, right? Our elders and our wisdom holders in the community as well, and just have these spaces where we can have these like conversations and lift that stuff up. Because as Aaron sort of pointed out, some of those things that people can't always sort of grasp. Wait, tech, wealth, marijuana, all these sort of things, like that's a real thing, and they're not mutually exclusive, right? And we have to accept and understand that. So.
Yeah.
And may I?
Sure.
I've been inspired by this, and I've had a chance to add a little bit more, if that's okay. I think we're all familiar with how, with that study that was done some time ago, that's repeated, where you have two identical resumes except for the name. And there's an Afrocentric name on one side, and there's a Eurocentric name on the other. And the Eurocentric resume ends up getting the interview, likely getting the job. I think that in some ways speaks to what we're talking about. That's the identity rather than just the representation, you know. And you know, when Patrick Lyoya was killed, one of the things that I thought was like, you know, not having a registration is not cause for a death sentence.
Yeah.
When we talk about all of these things, from the resume to food access, to all the comorbidities that go along with trauma and stress of dealing with racism, those things lead to death, right? Wearing a hoodie is not cause for a death sentence, right? Wearing locks is not cause for a death sentence, right? And so, yeah, the respectability politics in this case, I couldn't agree with you more. It's not just that a suit and tie. Now I'm embarrassed because I should have worn. But you know, like it's not a bulletproof vest. But the real point is there shouldn't be bullets in the first place.
Amen.
Yeah. I'll add. I used to work at a nonprofit in the North End neighborhood, and I used to teach performance poetry to mostly young black men who wanted to become rappers. My program was the wackest thing in the world because it was on Friday night at like 7 p.m., and I was teaching assonance and alliteration and comparing that to the work of the then popular Eminem and Jay-Z and all these folks. And every time my youngins used to come in on a Friday night in a neighborhood where literally they could choose to get into whatever they want to get into, they had to take their hats off. They had to pull their pants up. They had to come into the space as other than themselves. And I used to be baffled because I didn't understand how we couldn't recognize that these kids here at the center on Friday night were the good kids. They were the kids that were choosing otherwise. Even though they blend in with the rest of the kids, they were the kids that were choosing otherwise. So on this particular day, I challenged my kids to write about something other than, you know, death and other than money and other than sex. And, you know, on this particular day, I challenged them to write about this group of mostly young black men. What are we afraid of? So we know from the depictions in our media that our society is afraid of you. Who are you afraid of? What are you afraid of, right? We know that you put your pants on one leg at a time. It's human to have fear. What are you afraid of? Well, when we read our poems, one of the young men said, I fear who I become when I have to rob people to help my mom pay the rent. And that was the moment that I spoke about earlier when I knew that I was failing. And I might have been a damn good poetry teacher, but I was failing. I was failing my people and I was failing this work. I was failing my ancestors. And when I dug into this young man's history, I found out that his mom and the information on his registration form was to, like the phone number was to the local McDonald's. And, you know, I started to get mad, started to fuss at him. I called back and asked for his mom, and I found out that it wasn't even her shift, and she was only a part-time worker. And then I found out that this young man was considered the man of the household, even though he was only in middle school, and that he had 3 younger siblings, and his mom was a single mom in the North End neighborhood. And I didn't have any tools to give him. I didn't have, actually Flip the Script was right down the street, but I didn't know Brother Keith. I didn't know Tafari Brent at that time. I didn't have resources to pass this young man on to. He never came back to the program. He was scared that he was gonna get turned into the police. And I couldn't pull his mom in, but I just remember not having the resources. And I remember how afraid he was. I remember the moment when we all broke down in that session and cried. And the session, instead of about poetry, became about the trap. This cycle of, overlapping violence, poverty, high-risk activity, group involvement, and how in order to be safe, they had to project these images of toughness, right, so that they wouldn't be seen as potential victims. But then sometimes they had to make good on those threats. And they had to be approximate to groups, because other than that, they'd be alone in a dangerous neighborhood. But that often landed them dead or in prison. And, so that's what I think about when I think about, are we taking our people, are we making our people be respectable in order to value them? So 2 words, George Floyd, changed our collective, I would say, our country's holistic understanding of this issue. We were all frozen in place due to the pandemic, glued to our devices, many of us were, and we all got to see this officer's knee on this black man's neck, and we got to see the various arguments and justifications for it play out clearly. How do you think this changed our view, our community's view of public safety? And what do you think the appropriate response, policy-wise, so we can equip our people with some tools to go back and write some good legislation for us? What do you think the right sort of direction in lieu of George Floyd would have been to steer people in, policy-wise? So 2 questions. What are the policy solutions, and what are the changed community sentiments?
I can start.
Okay.
So to just, again, ground us in facts, when we look at 2020, nationally, how the 1,127 police killings began. 94 people were killed with mental illness welfare checks. 121 people were killed during traffic stops. 188 people were killed after nonviolent domestic disturbance. 251 people were killed after other nonviolent offenses. So 58% of killings began when police responded to nonviolent incidents. I think that's important. We look at data that just came out from Michigan State Police. Black drivers are nearly 80% more likely to be stopped by Michigan State Police than would be expected for their share of the population. And again, I've already stated that 50% of prosecutions in Michigan are for excluding DUI level traffic stops. So it's important to have that context when we talk about George Floyd, because it could happen here. It hasn't. I mean, we saw what happened in Grand Rapids, but I'm saying in Detroit proper. It could, though. And if we don't find a policy solution, such as communities like Ann Arbor are exploring the option of unarmed, non-police response for mental health emergencies. There are other communities that are exploring having a safety corps rather than police that can pull individuals over, people who are unarmed so that the conflicts don't escalate, people who give vouchers for repairs of one's vehicle when someone is poor rather than a ticket that they can't afford to pay, which then suspends their license, leads to a warrant, and lands them in jail, begins that traffic court to prison pipeline. And so I think it's important when we look at what happened to George Floyd, we should be thanking God that that has not happened here lately, and that we still have time in our community to fix this before a tragedy does occur. I think we have to begin to really figure out, if we want safe communities, why are police responding to matters that don't require an armed response, that don't require a law enforcement response? And then how can we better spend our dollars so that we properly allocate resources to situations that may require a law enforcement response?
Agree.
Dr. Tula, would you like to address how sentiments publicly have changed?
No, for sure. And I think I think they've changed and they haven't changed, right? When you talk to young people out here in the city, there's a natural mistrust, I think, for police. And I think that what happened with George Floyd only kind of confirmed a lot of people's experiences that they've had with police, but it just hasn't hit that extreme, that extreme outcome, right? But it just in terms of, police pulling up on the neighborhood where there's men gathered, or, being pulled over, and the sort of like aggressive questioning, sort of get out of the car, let's do this, that, and the third, the raids and things that might happen in certain neighborhoods. I think the sentiment towards police, I don't think was changed much by the George Floyd situation, but what I think it did do was it brought those conversations around, man, they can really kill somebody out in broad daylight while there's a gang of people recording with their cell phones out and things of that nature, like that could happen. So I think it brought it to the forefront just in terms of conversations. And I think the conversations that were happening were across a couple different spaces. Not only that could be me, or that could be my uncle, that could be my father, my brother, but also what would I do in that situation if I was a bystander, right? That sort of feeling of helplessness, right? Cell phones, okay, but can I do anything else? Like what's in my power, right? That's a conversation that me and my friends were having, right? What would we do if we were in that situation? And what sort of power and leverage do we have to sort of take power into our hands just in terms of protecting, our communities, right? So I think it brought those conversations out to the forefront. And I think we also have to remember that when the George Floyd situation happened, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and God bless them, their families, their spirits, and all the other ones that their names didn't even make it to that national news. But that was all occurring during us dying at disproportionate rates to COVID. You know what I mean? And so that was like just those were other layered conversations, and all those things that were happening, George Floyd, Arbery, Breonna Taylor, us dying at disproportionate rates, again, those are all symptoms of something much more sinister, right, that's going on in our communities, that impacts our community, that's sort of like an unfortunate sort of like embedded in our, that's been sort of embedded in our DNA, for lack of a better word, in our communities, right? And so those conversations, I think, were informed by the same things, but seeing that thing, and then I think what Chappelle had to show, the 8 minutes, 46 seconds, it brought those conversations out, and I think it made them more powerful and raw and real because of how it happened, right? That was this generation's, Emmett Till, right? That was this generation's Emmett Till on camera. And the reason I said this generation's Emmett Till, because I think when Rodney King happened, Rodney King survived. You know what I mean? Rodney King survived, right? But, we're all familiar with what happened with Emmett Till, so that's what I would say to that. And I agree with Aaron's policies. I think it goes back to the conversations we had before in terms of where we need to be investing, right? Recognizing racism is a public health issue, and recognizing the fact that we have to define things the right way. Because if we don't define things right, if we don't define crime the right way, if we don't define public safety the right way, then the solutions that we get, the solutions that we put in response to those are going to be wrong. Right, they're going to be misaligned, they're going to be misvalued. But so if we define things up front the right way and understand the appropriate actors and agents, then I think we get the right solution. So,
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I've got a question specifically for you under alternative reform efforts. Many of us, I think, understand in this room that there's a connection between lack of opportunity and high-risk behavior. So the median income for white Detroiters is over $16,000 more than African Americans, and $12,000 more than Hispanics. And by the way, that those two numbers suggest that the median income for Detroiters, for white Detroiters, is more than the median income for almost 78% of the entire city, right? So these statistics reveal an alarming impact on the racial wealth gap that prevents many of our communities from building generational wealth. What economic-centered resources or policies are necessary to amplify this issue, level the playing field, and can act as a public safety apparatus?
It's a great question, and we'd have to be here a lot longer for me to get really comprehensive and thorough there, but I would say honestly, for starters, access to upward mobility is key, critical, and necessary. You know, when we think about how, and I'm going back to the regional point, when we go back to looking at Metro Detroit, you know, and you see a lot of, you know, I mean, I having grown up here, and you know, we grew up not too far away from each other. We often had to cross 8 Mile to get our groceries, get our dry cleaning, get our, you know, even though we had stuff in our community, you know, the values were often different. If we wanted to get a job, be meaningfully employed, we had to get, you know, we had to, you know. So I think, you know, for starters, we're behind the 8 ball when we have to spend more to get as much, when we have to work harder to get as much. And so I think for starters, making sure that we democratize access and democratize opportunities, that by itself is a first step. I'd say another thing is, you know, entrepreneurship is critical and key, and we don't all have access to rich uncles, and we definitely don't have access to equitable capital, you know, outside of our own personal relationships. Detroit Future City, you know, recently did a study that said that Black Detroiters are not the one, even though we're more than 70% Black, or the city's more than 70% Black, we're not the ones getting mortgages. Right? We've seen historically, put redlining aside, we've seen historically that, you know, access to financing is disproportionate in this country. So, you know, all of those things gets back to the same thing we've been talking about. It is a systemic issue, right? You know, entrepreneurship by itself is not going to be a silver bullet. You know, creating equitable access to capital is not going to be the silver bullet. You know, if you are dealing with a person who has metastatic cancer, you have to give them chemotherapy, not an aspirin, right? And so it's not just addressing the symptoms; it's addressing the whole thing. And you know, and I want to be very, very brief in answering the question about how the sentiment has changed. By show of hands, how many of you, prior to George Floyd's death, had to have a tough conversation with somebody who said that we're post-racial? All right? I think seeing a Black man die the way that we did stops us from being gaslit.
Yeah.
Okay? When we say that racism exists,
That's powerful.
when we say that we have, you know, and we hear back, oh, but we have, you know, we had Barack, and, you know, it's you know, it's a shame that here we are in 2022 and we're still talking about firsts. Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a shame.
Absolutely.
And that you know, George Floyd was not the first. George Floyd was an example that speaks to the thing that causes us fear when we get behind the wheel of our cars and we're going at 10 and 2. That traumatic response that we're talking about when we see red and blue behind us, you know, the conversations that we have to have with our children, you know, who are about to go into driver's ed, all that stuff. I think that moment in 2020 compiled next to the fact that, you know, 14% of the population of Michigan accounted for 40% of the deaths because of COVID.
Right, yep.
Man, you know, like we had validation at that point that what we had been saying and experiencing, our lived experiences, was true.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that was, you know, one common outcome and reaction within the community.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. Such a rich addition. I'm working my way back towards you, Aaron. Dr. Tulu, in terms of alternative reform efforts, in 2020, the Kresge Foundation pledged $8 million to 20 Detroit organizations working to achieve racial justice in the Detroit metro area. This included DLive, a hospital-based violence intervention initiative that works with youth, young adults who have sustained acute, intentional, violent trauma to achieve very specific goals. Dr. Tulu, and I hope it's okay that I'm
It's all good. It's all good.
could you discuss your organization's work and the importance of deploying a variety of methods to address community violence?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll keep it brief, and I'll try to sort of anchor it with an example. But I mentioned earlier again, we are you know, an organization that's a response to, right, the public health crisis of community violence, right, where we see premature death and disability that's impacted young people. Right? Unfortunately, we become sort of acclimated and, you know, accepted the belief that, okay, yeah, a young guy dies at like 24, 25, 20. Like that's a very normal thing, unfortunately, you know, for our young men, right? No one's gonna be surprised if I tell you that, you know, hey, I had a death in the ED today, it was a Friday night, and that, you know, the guy was 27 or 28, right? But perhaps it may surprise you that the fact that that guy was in our ED in our trauma center maybe 2 or 3 times before that for similar injuries, right? But nothing was done at that time, right? And so nothing was done at that time because it wasn't recognized as a health issue, right? And that person wasn't seen as somebody that was suffering from something much more sinister with a disease process that's much more sinister. And that's secondary to, again, our misdefinition in terms of how we define things such as like crime, you know, and safety. So DLive is a response to that and an opportunity to sort of like push health equity and racial justice in the healthcare space, right? Because that was something that was that our young men and our young women were not having access to. And so as an example of how we do what we do is, again, addressing these root causes that lead that individual to being hurt and injured in the first place so that we can stop that recidivism, that cycle. Even in our work with DJC, we see the parallels of the spaces that we work in, right? We see that oftentimes, I would say greater than 50% for sure, right? Probably on upwards of 60 to 70% of our young men that have been impacted by violence have had some involvement with the justice system at some point, right? Are battling a stack full of tickets and traffic violations that is causing them to drive without papers and license and things of that nature, right? That then lends to them being, you know, pulled over and then going through that whole cycle again. I had a young man that I met recently who'd been shot. It was his 3rd time being shot. He's in his late 20s. He has a history of being in jail, right? Justice involved a few times, served about 3 to 4 years in prison. When he was in prison, right, when he first got, you know, arrested, he sat in jail for, and I forget the exact amount, but almost on upwards of a year because he could not afford bail, right? So he could not afford bail. And as a result of that, you know, judge kept pushing his case back, and he said, yo, doc, man, I just finally admitted to the thing and took a plea just so that, you know, because I couldn't afford it, I'm sitting in the thing, right, the whole time. And so he did his 3 to 4 years and has come home. He's unemployed, been shot 3 times, right? So you can see the intersections between this work, you know, and Aaron Keith's work with DJC, with what Rafferty does, as well as Force Detroit, in terms of like how all this community violence thing, it crosses all these sectors, right? It spans all these sectors. And so, you know, part of the things that we would do with him, right, is addressing these traffic issues and tickets and things of that nature that are preventing him from being civically engaged, right, with our community and having opportunities to these, you know, economic mobility and these things that would lead him and his family to thriving, right? Just had a daughter, right? So you can imagine the trajectory that would await his daughter if he's not connected to the appropriate resources and support and healing. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Another question for you, Aaron, this time. The Detroit Justice Center previously partnered with the Bailout Project, one of Detroit's revolving bail funds. Throughout the partnership, the area bail disruptors were charged with bailing out hundreds of people from local county jails in the Metro Detroit area. Today, local organizations such as Michigan Liberation continue to conduct bailouts to prevent collateral consequences of somebody being held pretrial simply because they cannot afford a nominal bond amount. Some states, such as California, Illinois, and more recently New York, have removed their cash bail system. And DJC has worked closely to move the needle on this issue here in Michigan. Ms. Keith, please discuss the cash bail system and its impact on public safety in the jurisdictions that use it.
So I think Dr. Tolu's example actually perfectly exemplifies why we need bail reform in Michigan. I found a stat from a Vera Institute of Justice report on the Wayne County Jail, which found that before COVID-19, just 9% of defendants in the Wayne County Jail were released on their own recognizance, meaning released without bail. 39% of those for whom the court set low cash bonds, $5,000 or less, an effective cost of $500 for those who can post 10%, remained in jail until their trials were over. while wealthier defendants, even those charged with more serious crimes, were able to bond out. And so I think it's just important, and I know we're short on time, so I'll keep it brief, but we really need to think about who's sitting in the jail and what it means. When you are arrested, you are presumed innocent until proven guilty, which means you have your day in court. Too often, even bond amounts of $200 keep someone who has merely been accused of a crime. They've not been found guilty of anything, merely been accused of a crime, in jail, away from their children. So their children might end up in CPS, in jail away from their jobs, so they may have no employment when they get out if their cases are dismissed. In jail away from ability to in any way better themselves. They don't have any access to programming or services or educational opportunities. It completely hijacks a person's life when they ultimately may be found not guilty of any crime. And so when we talk about why bail reform is slow in Michigan, we have to follow the money. And there are several local legislators who own bondsman companies who benefit economically from our current structure, not to mention revenue that's generated from people posting bond. And in addition to all the other collateral consequences I've mentioned, it's extremely troubling that people are generating revenue off the backs of innocent people in many cases. And when we look at people like Kalief Browder and others, the trauma that a person experiences from sitting in jail even a few days can alter the trajectory of their life. They may plead guilty to a crime they didn't commit because they just want to get out of there. They may end up succumbing to suicide, right? So we have to think about this in terms of why cash bail is not a partisan issue. We need to really move the needle on this in a way that's constructive, and there's been reform introduced in the House, but we need to see it pushed through because right now it's introduced every year and then it sits there. So that's an area of opportunity for us.
Yeah. I want to thank each of you for a passionate, substantive, and informative dialogue.
Thank you, moderator.
Please welcome Olajumoke Obayanju, the director of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's National Racial Equity Initiative.
Good afternoon. I hope everyone has enjoyed the first half of today's community conversation. I want to extend a personal thank you to Aaron, Dr. Tolulope, Mike, and Ilea. My name is Olajumoke Obayanju, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the National Racial Equity Initiative for Social Justice. Our conversation today continues, but this time over lunch. During this lunch segment, we will deepen our understanding by exploring the pillars of public safety, which we just discussed. You each are encouraged to engage in dialogue, to share your experiences, strategies, and coordination of community efforts. Let me introduce you to our CBCF fellows and staff who will facilitate the conversations. NREI Fellow Shelby Birch, NREI Fellow Cameron Blackmore, NREI Fellow Haley Hoskins, NREI Fellow Ayanakwe Amorabon, NREI Fellow Jasmine Payne, and Research Program Analyst Desiree Orr. And I cannot forget the NREI Senior Manager, Solomon Ayalu. Join us in the night gallery for a hot meal, individually packaged for your safety and your convenience. Vegetarian and vegan options are available in the main buffet. If you have any other dietary restrictions that our team should be aware of, please see a member of our CBCF staff. As a reminder, we ask you to continue wearing your mask when you are not actively eating or drinking. We'll see you back for our closing plenary session and moderated discussion at 1:40 p.m. Until then, enjoy your lunch.
afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our closing plenary session. Please join me in welcoming poet Joel Fluent Green as he performs an original new piece, I Was Here.
What's up? How y'all feeling? Oh, I should say what up, though, to all the Detroiters and everybody that's not fair. I'll bring you into our space. You know, we talked about meeting people where we are, so what up, though? My name is Joel Fluent Green. I'm a poet, event producer, proud Detroiter, father from the city. I love being here, proud West Sider, anybody's from the West Side. I also want to say something since I'm in this space right now. One of the many things I do besides being a poet, author, all that, is every Wednesday I'm blessed enough to hold a poetry workshop at a place called Mariners Inn, which is a shelter and a rehab center for men, primarily from the city, around the city, that deal with mental health issues, alcoholism, addiction issues, things like that. I'm really proud of that work. So if I had a chance to actually talk about myself, the issue individually today, I would talk about that. So if you look up marinersinn.org, they do amazing work in the city. I've been there for 6 years now, which is amazing that I've been in a position to be the poetry man at this beautiful place. So marinersinn.org is the name of that's the website. So look up Mariners Inn. All right. I get a little nervous with the talking, but I do the poems. All right, here we go. For Detroit. I was here. So I remember when downtown Detroit was dark. The people also. The sidewalks were barren, and the storefronts, they advertised wigs and gator shoes and Dob hats and pink ties. The hangouts were hidden. The eating was cheap. The appreciation was deep for creatives like us when this grit was a way of life. It wasn't a calling card. It wasn't a t-shirt. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't another tattoo. I was here. I remember, you can't tell me, shut. I was here. I used to catch those cabs. I used to walk down Grand River. I used to hop that Dexter or the Hamilton just to show up and arrive with like minds who came just like me. Ha! I was here when we did the art. We did the work. We set this whole thing up. We passed the torch to our cuz, our neighbors, not the visitors, not the rich, not the occupying new occupants. Block, I was here. So I remember when Midtown Detroit was narrow and the fun was so different, it was poor. It was inexpensive. I was here before my elders were displaced and the homeless were erased. I remember something so rugged yet gentle. It made me who I am. It made this beautiful Detroit progress possible when Coney Island was the only option at the late night escapades. Block, I was here. So I remember the smell of sewers, the steam on my steps. I'll never forget because I was present. I was here, so I'll remember. Thank you.
And now, please welcome Deputy Director for the Office of Ethics and Compliance and Senior Counsel of Dow, Inc., Camille Toney.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Welcome to all that are here. I'm Camille Toney. As you guys know, I work at Dow as Senior Counsel in our Office of Ethics and Compliance. One of my key roles was to help Dow legally, because lawyers have to be involved in everything nowadays, with our plan for social justice and racial equality. So Dow truly appreciates the partnership that we have with the CBC that was born out of some of those workings. And just really happy to be here, and thank you so much for having us be a part of it. So to me, this work is truly satisfying because in many ways, I have accountability for the integrity of Dow, equality, honesty, and the fairness to all our employees. And that really means something to have a person of color in that position at a big company. Very proud for that. And we all know, racial bias and division are deeply woven into our society. It's in corporate structures, it's in the safety structures of all environments. We've encountered racism, bigotry, and yes, violence in our communities. So we all know that. Some of us experience it firsthand, and some of us see it within our communities. At Dow, we believe that knowing is not enough. Instead, we believe we have a responsibility to change it, to make our communities fairer, more equitable, and safer for all. And to do that, you have to do more than just say it, right? You have to take action. That's why we've pledged $13 million over the next 5 years to accelerate change, and we've developed Dow Acts. That's the program that I was speaking to earlier. Dow Acts, which stands for Advocacy, Community, and Talent, is our three-pronged approach to address systemic racism and inequality within our places and the communities where we live, work, and play. And that's why I'm so excited about this next panel to talk about some of the solutions for having a safer Detroit. I'm a former resident of Metro Detroit. I'm very careful to not say the true Detroit, but I am, my sister lives in Boston Edison, and I'm always here, even though Midland is a bit far away. I am always careful to come back down to Detroit for all the good things that Detroit has to offer, and it truly is home for me. In addition to actions like financial support for small Black-owned businesses and our Dow Promise program that we have that provides grants to social support, economic support, and environmental projects in our community where we operate. Building safer communities is a big part of that big C in Dow Acts. So I and Dow join in welcoming the vision for a safer future for Detroit. And that's what this panel is all about. We have the opportunity to reimagine public safety and taking lessons from Detroit's past and present. We'll hear from 5 Detroit community leaders and learn their visions for Detroit's future. Our moderator for this panel is Orlando Bailey, Engagement Director of Bridge Detroit. Mr. Bailey is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, co-host of the podcast Authentically Detroit, and host of Urban Consulate. Previously, he served as Chief Development Officer for the Eastside Community Network. Rooted in his faith and love for his community, Mr. Bailey is a passionate advocate for city residents as experts in their lived experience. He proudly resides in Detroit's East Side. Please help me in welcoming this afternoon's moderator, Orlando Bailey. Mr. Bailey?
Can everybody hear me? Hey, y'all. Give yourselves a hand for being here. Ooh, we could do better than that. That was sad. Give yourselves a hand for being here. All right. I am super excited to have this conversation with some of the most amazing Detroiters, and I hope that you all will posture yourselves in the position not only to listen, but to participate and talk back. I'm from the church, so I'm used to people talking back to me. Amen? All right, my name is Orlando. I'm a lifelong, proud Detroiter who's passionate about shifting the narrative of Black cities and neighborhoods. I am also an Emmy Award-winning journalist. Did she say that already? Because that's what's on here. Yeah, I got one of those. Director of Engagement for Bridge Detroit. We are a news and engagement organization here in the city, and I am the co-host of the podcast Authentically Detroit and host of the Urban Consulate, where we convene people to have critical conversations about cities, on how to share ideas to build more just and equitable cities. And for our final and closing session, we are having a unique and inspirational group of panelists that are coming up. Each of these individuals intentionally serves in a capacity where they create a positive difference in the Detroit community and throughout Michigan, and I would say some of their work reverberates around the globe, okay? Our discussion for this session will focus on making an action plan and asking where do we go from here on making public safety or safety public. And I think this is just as important as naming the issues. We do a good job of naming the problem, naming the issues, naming the systemic barriers. We make the problem real sexy and then we leave 10 minutes for solutions. And so we're gonna spend this hour talking about solutions. I have the pleasure of introducing the panelists for this discussion. First, we have Nicholas Buckingham, campaign director for Michigan Liberation. Born and raised in Detroit, Nicholas has been dedicated to dismantling the criminal legal system by shifting prosecutorial culture through community accountability boards. Say that 5 times real fast and see if you get it. After spending 7 years incarcerated and catching the backlash of the felony stigma, Nicholas decided to focus his attention on higher education and raising his voice for criminal justice reform. I'm excited to hear more about you, Nicholas, but first, let's give his brother a hand. All right, next we have Ashley Carter. Ashley was also born and raised in Detroit and began her career as a public defender in New York City with the Legal Aid Society. For almost 5 years, Ashley represented hundreds of clients with cases ranging from low-level violations to serious felonies. Most recently, Ashley served as a senior attorney and deputy director in the Justice Project of Advancement Project's national office in Washington, D.C., providing legal and strategic support and helping to develop mechanisms for widespread community education and engagement around issues in the criminal legal system. Amazing work. Y'all help me welcome Ashley Carter. Thank you, thank you. We also have Angelique Peterson Mayberry, a native Detroiter born and raised in a place where she is still proud to call home. As a third-generation United Auto worker, the value of labor was instilled in Angelique at a very early age, and attending protests, marches, and community meetings with her mom was just a routine way of life in her home. Angelique is now the board president of the Detroit Public Schools Community District, where she acts as an added voice for those being educated in Detroit Public Schools. Y'all help us welcome the DPSCD board president, Angelique. All right, so I got one more introduction left, right? And this is an introduction of a young person, and I want us to make sure that we show her as much love as we possibly can, because what's going to happen is we're going to bring the voices of the young people from the margins to your face in this conversation. To your face. And so finally we have Azaria Terrell, a senior at Pershing High School, also serving as a Youth Action Board member for the Detroit Phoenix Center and host of the DPC podcast, Detroit Youth Rising. Azaria is an avid reader and hopes to one day become a writer. She'll be attending my alma mater, Eastern Michigan University, this fall as an English literature major. I feel you on the English. I feel you. As a journalist, I feel you on that. We are so proud of you, Azaria. Please help us welcome one more time, Azaria, y'all. Thank you. Listen, I'm so excited about this conversation. I know that, as always, we have a little bit of a time crunch. I know we started a little late, but I want us to be able to just hear all of the voices that we have up on here today. I want this to be a discussion, so even if I don't point a question to y'all, feel free to jump in. I want to ground us first in a radical embracing of love and joy while we have this conversation, but also embrace radical truth-telling as we have this conversation. So I'm going to begin with this. The pillars of public safety are economic opportunity, criminal justice, health equity, and education equity. While each pillar can be viewed separately, they do not operate in vacuums. How do we ensure that we do not lose sight of the big picture as we address these pillars of public safety in your respective roles? Do you have any examples of cross-sector collaboration between these pillars? And because my mama raised me right, I'm going to start with the ladies. Ashley, I'm going to let you go ahead first.
Well, something that I think a lot about when I think about the criminal legal system and how public safety is impacting communities, particularly communities of color, is how you don't start addressing public safety in a police car or in a courtroom. I think true public safety starts with safe communities and resources for people to build healthy, sustainable lives. And so I just want to start there and say, like, by the time we get to the courtroom, it's pretty late, and we already know how unreliable and how broken our criminal legal system is. So in terms of cross-collaboration, I think that first, we should be thinking about ways that we can support community members who might be experiencing challenges or difficulties without law enforcement, without violence,
Thank you for naming
and without the systems that have oppressed us for the entire time that this country has existed. And so I think there are good examples of programs that rely more on community resources and services than jails or police. I think that we're having some interesting conversations now about responses to mental health issues. I would like to see us removing law enforcement from those conversations and having more community focused. I mean, we heard today about a program that the Detroit police are engaged in that's providing mental health resources. But I think even before that, there are opportunities, and I think some schools that are trying to engage resources for mental health issues. I think that there are programs around the country that I'd like to see here that maybe take someone who's experiencing some challenges, who's engaged in behaviors that are criminalized, and then instead of turning straight to courts or jails and prisons, providing social services, resources, job training. Because again, I think a lot of the issues that we're seeing stem from economic oppression. And so shifting people from this carceral system towards resources, training, jobs, and education, I think are ways to do that.
Yeah, I mean, what you just described was the crux of what Defund the Police was trying to say in the wake of the George Floyd murder. Angelique, I want to come to you. Talk about how cross-sectoral collaboration to this end is necessary.
Yeah, so for a couple things I think I'll lift up first. One is, you know, in education, I think whether you're a parent or whether you're just a community member, safety and security in education is a priority. It just is. And yes, academic excellence and achievements is at the top. I'm a parent. One thing I look for in schools when I was deciding what school I wanted my children to go to was safety. And so I don't think we can minimize that. I think we have to make sure that we lift that up. But what I'm proud, one thing that we've done in DPSCD is, you know, we are one of the few school systems who has their own, I will say what the new name is for this team, public safety team. They are no longer called DPSCD-PD. Those days are over, and I think it was imperative, this was even before some of the civil unrest happening where the thoughts were beginning, because we just haven't done a great job of telling our story in terms of what we do, what they do. They're not put into the school district to arrest children. I've been in schools where it's the external people who are disturbing the learning environment. Let me just say that again. It's parents sometimes, it's other people sometimes coming into the schools disturbing the learning environment, and that's problematic. And so it's not about policing students, it's more about providing a safe environment for learning for our students. So changing the whole name is because the cross-sector space is the community space. We have something called a oversight program. And so the oversight committee is comprised of teachers, there's a student on that committee, and there's community on that committee. And what they're tasked with doing is if there are any complaints, any investigations that need to be looked further, deeper into, then that's what that committee would do. So it's removing some of the biases that may exist when you have somebody closer to the work, looking at the work. So that's one thing I'll say. The other thing is, I think that we just have to meet parents where they are. We have to meet parents and students where they are and elevate them from that space. I don't care how high they are, they can always go higher. So in doing that, the whole child approach that we're trying to take as a school district is almost like community schools. And so I'm not sure if people understand, but community schools is where, you know, you have labor, you have clergy, you have community, you have somebody who it's not just about the educators, but instead it's about the stakeholders and all the wraparound services that are required to educate our students. We'd be disingenuous to say teaching our students now is easy and it's reading, writing, arithmetic. Those days are over because, as Ashley mentioned, you know, we're prioritizing mental health. And yes, I graduated 30 years ago from high school. Yeah, every time I say that, I'm waiting to hear somebody say, no, you don't look like it. But nobody said it, so I think I'm starting to look like it, right?
I just said it.
Okay, you just said it.
Somebody.
Okay, thanks, Orlando.
You're welcome.
But I'm a product of DPS, and I just remember the wraparound services that were provided to me at that time. And we know emergency manager got rid of a ton of that. We were just talking in the back, and so she'll share her story, but something like ROTC, you know, that was eliminated from public education, and that's absurd. But the opportunities that exist when you have wraparound programs like that, and you have things beyond math and reading, which we know are priorities, I think those are the things we have to make sure that we don't let sit on the table while we're trying to focus on something else. So we can't have a conversation about academic excellence without having a conversation about safety and security.
I appreciate that. Azaria. We're talking about cross-sector collaboration that gets at these pillars of public safety. Do you have anything that you want to offer to that?
Sure. So I think, so like when you think about these pillars and you think about like how high up they are and how a lot of the times like the smaller problems are ignored, I think that's like one of the main reasons that these smaller problems slowly start to develop into like bigger problems and stuff. So, but another thing that I start to realize is that a lot of people don't notice what some of the smaller problems are from what they naturally believe the community thinks the smaller problems are. So for a small problem for the community to be maybe not enough traffic signs or not enough stop signs or this, that, and the third, but what they're not thinking about is like the amount of accidents that happen when students are crossing the street from fast drivers, or they're not thinking about the late nights when, or the power outages when there's no signs or symbols. And now the community is forced to just try to fix the solution themselves, and the youth are only leaving it up to the adults. They're just waiting to see how it's going to be solved, and they're only going off the solutions. They're not able to give their inputs. They're not really a part of the solution-making process. They're just more of the people where they come to like, hey, do you like this solution? Okay, if not, we'll go back and fix it. Not if you have any inputs on how we can fix the solution. It's just like, oh, we're just gonna go fix it and bring you a new one and see if you like this one. And it's just like a repetitive process. So I think like more focus into like inner community smaller problems and not like city-based city problems would just make it like you'll start to really, that's how you really get into the community, because although we're working together with different communities to make a better city and eventually a better world, it really you have to get like dig deep into the neighborhoods with the families to start to figure out what the real small problems are and where the first step actually begins.
You better say it.
Hey, yeah.
You better say that. I love where you went with it, because oftentimes when we talk about public safety, we always point to criminalized behavior. But when we're talking about making safety public, there are so many actors that contribute to what is safe and what is not. Government and how we design our streets and these traffic lights. Kids got to get to school. That's public safety. Corporations and our utility companies cutting off people's water and cutting off people's lights. That's not safe. That's not safe. And so I really appreciate you going in on that granular level. You go, girl. Go ahead. Nicholas, it's on you, bud.
You want me to follow behind?
Do the best you can, sir. I'm glad it's not me.
I know, right? No, everything she said was spot on, and I think like two things. One, I'm in a space of academia, so I'm a student at University of Michigan in the School of Social Work, And this conversation about public safety is really important, you know, amongst social workers, amongst therapists, psychologists, and so much more. You know, these are, you know, quote unquote, the professionals that will be coming into our communities. And as we're having these internal discussions about public safety, right, a lot of the folks that's coming from academia will have the leverage around legislation, the leverage around policy making and what that would look like in a lot of our communities that these folks do not come from. So, you know, just want to make sure that I say that. But, you know, there was something that Azariah has said when we're talking about public safety, you know, this, like having a microscope on the problem in a community rather than overall, like the entire Detroit city. And I said this earlier, there's a person in Detroit by the name of Yusuf Bunchy Shakur. About 10 years ago, he started a campaign which he labeled it bringing a neighbor back into the neighborhood, right? And so the idea is to understand who is in your community, who is your neighbor, when these issues around safety, violence, or whatever else we want to classify it as, when they do come up, how do we start to have these conversations amongst us first, and then start to come up with the important solutions, rather than having to run and get, you know, either the police involved or some other entity involved in that. So, you know, just hard act to follow, but she said something really important there, especially for a lot of activists and organizers. You know, we're always talking, what areas are you focused on? Are you micro? Are you macro? You know, are you local? Are you national? You know, but yeah, like looking deep into the community and going straight to those folks and having those conversations is important. Just recently, I was reading a report, and I think this is like an example, right, with the speed bumps. So we see like it's a lot of speeding that's happening across the city, and you know, a lot of folks would think like, yo, the solution is to put speed bumps up and down every single street. But then when there's somebody on your block that's having a heart attack, it makes it harder for the ambulance to get there, right? So like, is that a necessary solution, or did they, you know, come into the community and have conversations with folks on how do we address speeding? So I'm just using that as a small example. And what you said was like it was profound, and that's what we need to do.
Let's talk about the theme, safety being made public. And I think I have to name that a lot of the murders that we've seen, particularly on Black men and women, even the murder of George Floyd, had taken place in public spaces. George Floyd was murdered in a bike lane, right? And so I think that all too often we are carrying, and you sort of talked about this a little bit earlier, this trauma that is associated with public spaces and public amenities, defensive planning, and all these kind of things that show up that make it hard for the ambulance to get down there. But I want to talk about the national outrage that was sparked after George Floyd and the outcry toward public safety reform. How can we safeguard and prioritize public safety reform in a constantly shifting political environment? Nick, we'll start with you.
Oh, start with me. Yeah, during like the George Floyd, even myself have seen something during the uprisings here in Detroit. You know, there was over 100 days of protesting, direct actions, marches, that was coming from different, you know, organizations, different entities. And, you know, in one setting, you actually seen how community folks were coming together to have these conversations, but they weren't having these conversations behind closed doors. They weren't in the basement of a church. They weren't in beautiful facilities like this, but they were actually occupying spaces within the community. There's a person in Detroit, I love doing shout outs to folks. There's a person by the name of PG, and they started to do like these 313 liberation zones. So occupying areas in the city of Detroit to talk about, one, safety, right? Another pillar is community connections, organizers, and then resources. This wasn't an effort to go out and get the most notable organizer or the most notable speaker, but these were just people right here within the community that was having these conversations. And from there, we start to see all of these different things pop up, right? Shout out to Aaron for shouting out Michigan Liberation with, the Bell, with Bell and Folk South, but this is another entity that was created, right? A brake light clinic. We were able to do a brake light clinic on the east side of Detroit, which is like a very small thing. But this was a way for, community folks to come out and support other community folks. And people are like, why is a brake light clinic important? Right? Well, we see the interactions with police and black men. We see the interaction with the police forces across 8 Mile and the more suburban communities and how they come across with Detroiters, right? And so it's that keeping people safe. If I can fix your brake light, this might save your life down the line. Whether if it's going to come from like the hands of police brutality or the traumas of incarceration in the court system. So, I believe constantly having these conversations and not allowing these conversations to die out, but also putting it into fruition. What we speak about, we have to actually put it into action. Mama Shu, right here in Highland Park, right, created a community where like I feel 100% safe in the Mama Shu community than like anywhere else. And I know that, when we talk about safety in that community, I don't have to imagine the police force keeping me safe there. But the neighbors around Mama Shu are the ones that's keeping that community and myself safe.
Ashley, you're a lawyer, and I want to get your perspective on policy reform, right? But the question was also around a shifting political landscape. And so I want to come back to Ashley. We actually have someone who has to run for her position. We have a DPSCD board member. Not only are you a board member, but some folks would consider that a politician, right? And so when we have midterms and we have elections that come up and we have folks and we have allies that are in these positions that are supposed to, be the champions for this kind of reform, and they term out or they don't win again, and that sort of thing goes away. You talked a little bit earlier about the renaming of the DPSCD Police Department. What kind of strategies of reform are you seeding now that will sustain your tenure within the Detroit Public School Community District?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. When I ran the first time, I was blessed enough to be the #1 vote getter in the city. So at that time, it was post-emergency management. There were 56 people running for 7 positions. And the terms were staggered. So you had 2 people with a 6-year term, 3 people with a 4-year term, 2 people with a 2-year term. So now it's 4 years for everyone. And I really contemplated if I was going to run again because I'm not a politician. And I think that is something that I had to wrestle with. And what I saw is that politics continued to rear its head in the most negative way, and it was impeding the work. Prior to COVID, DPSCD was on the rise, and we have a tagline: when students rise, we all rise, right? We know that's the tagline. But we had minimal teacher vacancies, down from 300. We were under 50. We had the highest test scores in the state. We had teacher salaries, it was almost $10,000 in teacher salaries. Absenteeism was down, attendance was up. I mean, we were rocking and rolling. I'm gonna be honest with you. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, it put us in a place where we were crippled, like so many of you. There were so many things we just couldn't do. All of this reform that we had on the agenda to continue to do became halted. I shared with this young lady, Ms. Azaria, that I have a 2020 graduate who was unable to go to prom, she was a salutatorian for graduation. However, she had to go and record that at the school, and then everything was virtual. No graduation. And so people, that Angelique, that's nothing. But it is something. We all went. One way or another. That is a social space that if we don't acknowledge it, we see the remnants of people who haven't had that for years. So my platform the first time was the truth. I just think people should know the truth. People may not like what they hear, but I want them to be equipped and guarded with what they know to be the truth. And so as we try to continue this work, because, you know, somebody who is the only person that could probably tell me what to do, that guy told me to run again. And so I am. But for me, the politics, there's really a space that it impedes work when politicians put personal agendas in the space, and in this instance, with young people. There are advantages to being in spaces, in rooms. We're a policy-making board. We make policy all the time. And so we're always thinking about, at the center of every decision, there's a young person's face. Is this the right thing to do? All adults will not agree with all the decisions that we make. We went through a period where we were online. We were one of the few districts who were online. Vaccination rate was low. Detroit, infection rate was high. Teachers were saying we're not coming in. These were really tough decisions. Parents said, well, I have to go to work. You know, who's gonna watch my kid? These were all of these. I had many sleepless nights because the decisions that were required during COVID were not easy. And so we thought about what is the best way that we can, one, keep these young people safe, and I'm going back to safety and security, but what is the way we can keep them safe and still educate them? So that is what we decided to do. And now we look at the learning loss that occurred because of COVID. So now how do you provide opportunities for young people to close this learning gap? So yes, okay, summer school, yes, after school programs. At the end of the day, you can build it, but they have to come. And that's the space that we have to go beyond the school walls into the community to, one, get them to trust us with their most prized possession, and then two, to know that when they are there, they're going to get more than reading, writing, and arithmetic. Because it requires so much more than that to make it out here.
Yeah.
And we've seen that. And so those are some of the things that I think, you know, the civil unrest that occurred during the George Floyd, I have a 23-year-old son. And the collaborations that DPSCD did with like NAACP Detroit chapter, these different spaces on stops and cops, and should you have to have these conversations? Absolutely not. Do you have to? Absolutely. I'm still horrified if I see lights in my rear view. And I'm a grown woman. Am I gonna walk away from the stop? I don't know. Are my children gonna walk away from the stop? I don't know, but I do know I also have really good friends who wear that blue badge. And they're not all bad. But how do you know if the one stopping you is? And that's the part that they shouldn't have to worry about. They should have to only worry about going to school and getting every learning experience that's available to them while they're in our care. However, that's not the reality now.
Ashley, as a lawyer, I want to ask you from just the legal and legislative standpoint. Number one, how do we get to reform? And how do we enshrine it and protect it from being tampered with regardless of who is in elective office?
So that's a tough question.
That's my job.
And I do think that something I'm really passionate about, and well, first I would just say that we're on a journey. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's like a misconception that there are quick answers and quick solutions, and we're dealing with deeply entrenched issues that are gonna take, probably lifetime, like at least my lifetime to address. And something that I've identified in my work focused on communities is a couple things. One is that I really don't think people know the power that they control or the power that they hold. And something that I really love about Michigan Liberation is that there's this real effort to empower communities to make decisions and to step into spaces where there's an opportunity to move the needle. Like, I do a lot of work with formerly incarcerated people in voter registration. And I think it's so important because so many people who have spent time in jail and prison think that they can't vote. And in Michigan, they can.
You better say it.
And so, empowering people and really engaging in power mapping and showing people who controls what. In 2020, in the thick of everything that was happening with George Floyd's murder and trying to be responsive, there was a huge prosecutor race in Wayne County. And one of the things that really struck me about that, watching that unfold, is how we talk about race. Race is obviously central to the conversation, but there's a class conversation.
You come
that I
on,
think,
Ashley.
that I think we need to be having. And I think that in order for us to really make transformational change, we have to be engaging in community conversations that address race, but also class. And in a place like Detroit, where it's a mostly black city, we've
Your
still
oppressor
got
may look like you.
We've still got
right.
some people in positions of power that I don't think have our collective best interests
Right.
at heart.
And they look like
And so that's, I think in like big black cities, I think we've got to deepen the conversation. And I think we got to spend the time between elections galvanizing support for the issues we care about. I'll also just say something that really stuns me, because my entire career has been focused on issues of the criminal legal system, is how little people in power know about how these systems are impacting people. We just had a convening that was focused on housing and how directly impacted people are discriminated against in housing policy. And there were people who lead organizations who were like blown away by the stories they heard from directly impacted people.
You know what? Okay. Yes.
I just,
How you not know?
It strikes me that people don't, but they don't. And so I think that our work as people who care is to tend the soil so that when it's time to vote, the seeds have already been planted and that we're ready to move forward. And so I think it's just a long game. I think it's a multifaceted strategy. And I think it's really centered on community engagement and empowerment.
Yes. Way to drop the mic. You know, one of the things that I am constantly trying to remind folks of is that there are all kinds of expertise that exist in community that we need to respect and that we need to provide agency for. There are all kinds of power that exist in community that we need to respect and that we need to provide agency for. And I'm talking about academic scholarship, I'm talking about lived expertise, the whole spectrum. And what we have in Detroit really is this intra-community caste system that don't nobody want to expose or talk about, whereby the people who oppress us actually look like us, right? Because we've been able to taste a little bit of power and we are comfortable with that white adjacency. If we're gonna talk about it, Ashley, let's talk about it. You know what I'm saying? And so naming that and giving stage to the academic scholarship and Miss Lula on Beaconsfield, who been there for 60 years, who also has scholarship, but about her community, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's the piece. Azari, we gotta come to you, and then they gonna flash 10 minutes up. Y'all wrong. Not 2 minutes. Okay, Azari, I wanna talk to you. You voices are often dismissed as too idealistic or are underrepresented altogether in conversations about public safety among stakeholders. How do we make space for the young people to share their visions for a safer community? How can we better champion the youth's perspectives to ensure their ideas are not only valued, but implemented and not tokenized?
I love that question. And one of the main reasons I love that question is because I feel like often, a lot of the times, before a youth even has the opportunity to use their voice or to get offered the opportunity to speak on like a panel like this, a lot of people, well, a lot of adults and a lot of other young people also, the first thing that they immediately do is they look at the youth's age. They will immediately look at the age and they will immediately start to think, you're not qualified, you haven't lived long enough. Like, that's often a thing I keep hearing from a lot of my family members and a lot of older family members that say, you're not old enough to understand. And at one point, I have to always ask them, I'm like, so at what age are you old enough to understand what is happening around you? Because I believed it was like 7 or 5. That's when you start to realize this is wrong and this is bad. I know not to do that no more. I know not to touch this. So you know good from bad. You are able to communicate your feelings. You're able to use your voice. So why, when it hits 17 or when you hit 18 and you really start to want to use your voice to say, hey, the police shouldn't be putting their hands on them, hey, and you get belittled because of your age. So I feel like one thing I encourage all people and all like youth to do, even younger youth, to the middle schoolers and to the elementary schoolers, and I encourage adults to do to youth, is to stop looking at the age and more of just the person that's speaking. Look at them as if you would any other person. If you would go to Barack Obama, I'm pretty sure any adult in front of Barack Obama would sit there and listen to what he had to say with all of respect and all of the listening. They would take every word he said to heart, and they would move forward that day knowing and using that information to better themselves and better their community. But I encourage people to use that same respect that you will with any great figure that you think would install that knowledge on you, with a minor, with a child, because these same children could grow up into these people. That Barack Obama was a child one day, and I do believe if his voice had been ignored, he would have never gotten to the point where he was at now. And that is with anybody who thinks they're in a high position. You were once a child, and you had a plan, you had something in mind that you knew would change your community, would change the world. Martin Luther King had a dream, and if it had been ignored, we would have gotten nowhere. And it would have made no difference if he had that dream when he was 17, if he had done it when he was 30. So I encourage people to really go into schools, really go into the communities and talk to these children. Do not question them. Do not try to peer pressure these answers out of these children, like, hey, so, because I know often a lot of times I ask my friends, I'm like, so why don't you go to this community event with me? Why don't you go speak? And they're like, hey, well, I don't think that's a good idea. What if I say something they don't like? That's why I know everybody who's met me here today knew I was very nervous, because that's one of the very first things all youth think when we're speaking to an adult is, what if I say something wrong? What are the consequences? What is that backlash I'm going to have to face, not from just these respectable, honorable people, but from my parents, from my community, for people who look at me on an everyday basis? What if they do not agree with me and my decisions to change the community? What if they're happy with what they're living in? So I may believe that, yes, our community needs to change. These potholes have to go. We need more stop signs. We need more what's the word? I'm having a brain fart. More like community, I cannot think of the word for it.
You got it.
But it's like community organizations to help
The
like
forums.
youth safety.
Wrap around.
And I believe that, but a lot of my friends at school don't. They love the way their neighborhood is. They love that they can just run across 7 Mile without looking both left and right and not worry about any consequences. They love the fact that they can just go out at nighttime and yell blast music. They love that energy. They love that feeling, but they don't understand the danger that comes with it. They don't understand the danger that is if a younger version of you had tried to do that same thing. It would not be as so safe. And I do believe when a youth who is headed in the right direction, not to say not all of us are, because some of us are all headed in the right direction. We just have to take a different path. We're not given that opportunity to take the path that is normally headed that way. For me, I'm not a 4.0 student. I'm not a valedictorian, but I'm still given the opportunity to use my voice and help my community. And I still push hard for my good grades, and I do what I have to do. And that's some things I know people would overlook, because most people, when they're looking for youth advocates and they're looking for youth leaders, they're looking at Renaissance, they're looking at Henry Ford, they're looking at Cass Tech.
But where you go though?
At
Where
the
you go?
4.0s. I go to Persian High School. It's very deep east. It's not as well known. So I tell people not to look at those 4.0 students. Don't go to those all-star. I mean, you can. Please don't ignore them. Please give them the recognition for their hard work and all of their dedicated effort. But please go to those students who are struggling, because those are the ones who are experiencing the community around them the real way. Those students who do have 4.0s, their parents are dropping them off at school. They have a dinner every night. They have clothes in their drawers. Those students with 2.5s, but they're coming to school every day trying to get their education, they're the ones walking in the snow. They're the ones babysitting their little sister when their mama has to work 10 hours. Those are the ones who are really experiencing the community efforts, and they're putting their best foot forward to better their lives and better their community lives. Those are the youth I inspire people to go look for and to talk to, because those are the ones who are giving you real answers and not the ones that you think you may want to hear.
You better say it.
Orlando, can I just add one thing? I know, okay. So I see the timer too. So Let me just say, adults say the wrong thing too. And everybody doesn't agree with adults either, so I guess we're all in the same space. But I really just want to say too, to Zaria, she is spot on. So this year, for the first time, we have added youth voice to our board. So not just young people who are gonna get coffee and but they actually sit at the table, at the board meeting. They went through, so there was an interview process. They weren't the 4.0 students, right? But more of the well-rounded students. Some of them are going into advocacy space or organizing, but they want to learn more about policy. So they went through this interview process, and then their peers voted for them. So we have 3 young people who are on the board, 2 seated and 1 alternate. And so you're right, if we're going to involve you, involve you. Don't just have you there, involve you. So that we hear your voice, but are we really doing something about the voice that we hear? Or are we creating a voice for you? Because we have adults using young people to carry their own message. That's right. So it's taking their voice away, but it's giving them our voice. And I think we have to be mindful of that. So I just wanted to lift that up as well.
Yeah. I want to do a quick round robin because they are telling me to rap, and I'm breaking the rules by doing this, but I want to make sure I include everybody's voice on this because a lot of the other tenets that we wanted to talk about, education equity and health equity, we sort of touched on, but let's talk about criminal justice and criminal justice reform. And according to a Detroit Free Press study, there was a 5% increase in violent crimes, sexual assault, robbery, assault, and murder in 2021. And I want to give it some context because that sounds so bad, but our crime rate had been dropping really steadily for years on end. And we saw, especially from 2020 when everybody was inside. People went outside in 2021. So I just want to give that context, right? All right. But anyway, crime rates, as they do in urban cores, they fluctuate, right? And so I want to ask everybody this question. Keep your remarks brief because we got to go. How do we address a fluctuating crime rate across the city without relying on traditional methods of policing? Nick, we'll start with you.
Define the police. Take the resources and put it back into the community in the ways that we can really address the needs and the harms that are happening. Wanted to get that off. I think, over time, the rhetoric of like either being tough on crime or smart on crime is often coming up, right? And I had a professor recently said the pendulum is swinging in a different direction for this generation. I don't like to use the term being smart on crime, but understanding like that's where like our community really needs to move in. One, we need to really identify what crime is, right? And a lot of the things that we're seeing, especially here in the city of Detroit, are methods of survival. And these methods of survival are leading people right into the criminal legal system. So I think like that's one, having a true idea, of around crime and why is, getting to the root cause of it. Oftentimes we will say like, oh, poverty is the root cause of crime. And if we know that, and we continuously say that year after year, decade after decade, what are we really going to do about poverty and addressing that, right? You go across 8 Mile, we don't hardly see that type of crime. We go in, and I go to school at Ann Arbor, like, I am allowed to do mushrooms and smoke weed on campus, but the moment I leave out of there, I can be criminalized, right? So again, identifying the definition around crime and allowing that pendulum to not just continuously swing, but to actually make a stop where we can, get really hyper-focused on being more smart of how we address the issues within our community when it's centered around crime.
All right, we in trouble, but go ahead, Ashley.
I think that something that we really have to do when we're talking about crime rates is look at the systems that have failed us. If the crime rates are raising and the police are getting more money, the police are failing us. Because if they were doing what we think they do, wouldn't there be a decrease in crime? The city of Detroit's budget, 30% of it goes to the Detroit police. 30% of the budget. So if we're seeing a rise in crime, I would encourage our communities to really imagine what else is possible. What are some other solutions that we can be looking at to address crime? Because the police, which is the one we keep dumping all of our money into, is failing to meet the moment. I also would just encourage people to really look at clearance rates, because one of the things a lot of law enforcement don't actually do is solve crimes. So if we have people in law enforcement who are charged with keeping us safe and they can't actually solve the crimes, I don't really see how that helps keep us safer. So I really think we should be investing in alternatives to policing, but also addressing the root causes of why people are engaged in behaviors that are criminalized. If you talk about an increase in crime in 2021, well, what was different? People were economically oppressed. There was a disruption to a lot of people's lives and the way that they function. Also, kind of going off of what Nick was saying, something I really encourage people to do is really provide some nuance. There's a difference between stranger crimes and intercommunal violence that might stem from something like gang engagement. There's a way to deal with gang engagement that's very different than stranger crime. And I wish that we could provide more resources and more thinking into what those different responses should be. And then, well, I'll stop there.
Okay, because we gotta
Yes.
go. Okay, 60 seconds. Angelique.
Why do I only get, okay, so I'll use 3 words: access, opportunity, collaboration, period. Our kids need access to things that they traditionally have not had access to before. We need to collaborate. When we see what's working well, let's collaborate. Quit trying to keep stuff to yourself. And then opportunity, give them the opportunities to soar and be disruptive. No longer are we saying, oh, okay, you fought a kid, you're out of school for the, we're doing in-school suspensions because we want to correct the behavior and not be punitive. You can't learn if you're not at school, period, right? But we've got to realize that counselors, they don't necessarily, they don't have, that's not what they're there to do to deal with the activity that may be disruptive from outside. Let somebody else, they're there to counsel our children, wraparound services, what are the opportunities? We're saying college and career ready. Everybody's not going to college. Thank God Azaria's going, right? But everybody's not. So if they're not, are they going into skilled trades? Are they going to be an entrepreneur? We want them ready for society, whatever that means for them, to say that they've got the resources and they've received at least an introduction to it, they've had access to it while they were at DPSCD.
Thank you. And I think it's only fitting that we give you the opportunity to give the last word to Zaria.
One of the things, I'm just going to keep it quick and simple. One of the things I do want to bounce off what he said, what is crime? Because I feel like if the crime rate is growing up, a lot of the things that people don't look like is what actual tiny crimes are being committed. Because while the whole 3-4 cops' cars are focusing on that store around the corner that just got robbed, none of you are focusing on the 3 children that just got brutally abused and beat up around the corner, that wasn't caught on camera, that wasn't put out into the media, but they're traumatized and they probably are in the hospital somewhere, which is now medical bills for that family. But can the family go press charges? No, because maybe it is a school-related or a young youth-related thing that happened, but this child is still hurt. This is still a crime. This is still violence. And most of them are being affected by petty crimes like that because these petty crimes are not considered real crimes. These are community crimes. Mm-hmm. But these are what's making your crime rate go up, because if they think it's okay to beat up a kid around the corner, they'll think it's okay to go rob your store. And they'll keep doing it until they get to bigger crimes that they think you will ignore. Because if you ignore something as small as a minor being abused or beat up or bullied, neglected, whatever, not having hot water, heat, if you ignore something so small as a child being forced to live in these conditions, then these children grow up thinking that the crimes that they are committing, the crimes that are around them, these are minor crimes considered to the ones that are happening in DC, like George Floyd being killed. Yeah. This is a minor crime considered to what the world is facing. These are not crimes need to be worried about. And this is what they should be worried about. Of course, we have all these major problems up here, but if we are nowhere near stopping these, then these are only going to build into even bigger problems that the future is going to have to deal with.
All right, that granular approach. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. Can you guys give them a great big hand? Thank you so much for your contributions. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Orlando P. Bailey, for our dynamic session this afternoon, as well as all of our panelists. And now, returning to the stage, is Olajumoke Obayanju, the director of the National Racial Equity Initiative at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation.
Wow, what a fantastic day. What a fantastic panel. Thank you to Nick, Ashley, Orlando, Angelique, and Azaria. Please give them another round of applause. It has been an honor to be among such a phenomenal group of thought leaders, community members, and change makers. For those of you who joined later in the day, my name is Olajumoke Obayanju. I am the director of the National Racial Equity Initiative for Social Justice. As we wrap up the day, I would like to start by thanking those of you who made today a success. Thank you to our Congressional Black Caucus members, CBC Chair Representative Joyce Beatty, CBCF Board Chair Representative Terry Sewell, and Michigan's own Representative Brenda Lawrence. Thank you to our morning and afternoon poets, Tawana Petty and Joel Fluent Green. Thank you to all of our morning and afternoon session panelists. Thank you to our social justice, art, and activism participants, Carol Marisol, the ARC of Detroit, Central Detroit Christian, and Detroit Phoenix Center. Thank you to our event sponsor, General Motors, and NREI partners, Dow, Capital One, and Target. Thank you to our production partner, RJ White Event Productions, and our Detroit-based vendors, College for Creative Studies, Full View Productions, Continental Food and Beverage, Event Source, Brittany Flowers, and Golden Limo Transportation. It's been our pleasure to partner with each of you. To my CBCF leadership and staff, our fellows, the management team, our marketing and communications team, Center for Policy Analysis and Research, and our outstanding strategic events team, thank you. More importantly, I would like to thank you, all the participants. Without your input, your shared ideas, your discussions, this community conversation would not have been possible. The Congressional Black Caucus Foundation established the community conversations to facilitate a community-level dialogue between legislators and policymakers and activists and community members around the pillars of public safety, and to highlight the current work and great work that's being done in Detroit, Michigan, and to inspire solutions that lead to concrete, actionable steps. As a foundation, we recognize that conversations around reform are often centered in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., but the great work is happening here. Great work is happening in cities like Minneapolis and Brooklyn and Oakland. And we cannot have these conversations without the marginalized and the communities that are most affected. We cannot continue to have these conversations without immersing ourselves in the lived experiences and realities that are often varied from the people in power. We cannot continue to have these conversations in silos, and to achieve public safety in Detroit and nationally, there must be a deliberate unification of efforts from system actors, communities, and legislators. So I thank you. I thank you for welcoming us today. Thank you for providing the space to begin these conversations. So thank you to Detroit. Now, where do we go from here? How do we move away from conversations to change? How do we move from ideas in a room to legislation? How do we move from talking to actually walking? As I close out, I'd like to share just a few gems and thoughts that were captured throughout the day, because some of the answers have already been disclosed, and I want to be able to have some notes to reference when I get back to DC. So here are just a few comments. Training for police should be ongoing. Sometimes you have to attack the issues with action. We must be righteously upset when they do not pass the laws that benefit the quality of our lives. We have to know what's happening at the local level and get involved. We have to engage in conversations that don't only involve race, but involve class. We must recognize that those that are closest to the problems are also closest to the solutions. It's not about policing students, it's about policing or providing, a safe space for learning. We have to stop talking about the us and them paradigm and focus on togetherness. Budgets shouldn't have to compete. We should all get what we need. Young people are often rendered voiceless in these conversations, and we must involve our young people in this discourse. And lastly, the recognition that we're on a journey and we are dealing with a deeply entrenched issue that may take a lifetime, and we have to be okay with that. So I want to say thank you once again for attending today's NREI Community Conversation. I hope it's inspired you. I hope it's energized you. And while this event may be coming to a close, our work continues. Please look out for our NREI post-event Take Action Guide for more ways to get involved in the fight towards racial equity and to learn how to take action in your communities and beyond. If you missed any parts of today's sessions or you would like to rewatch it like I'm gonna do, please make sure that you visit the CBCF website and visit our on-demand tab, and the sessions will be available next month. Hold on to those QR codes and scan it often to stay in the know and discover future events like our Policy for the People Virtual Health Equity Summit on May 12th. Visit @CBCF Inc. on social media or visit www.cbcfinc.org to learn more. And speaking of QR codes, we need you to pick up your phones one more time and scan the code on the screens behind me to complete the event survey. Your feedback is vital, it's crucial. I promise you, we look at it, we read it, we utilize it, and it's helpful for the success of our future events. We hope you'll take about 3 to 5 minutes to complete it. As you leave today, enjoy dessert and a special NREI gift in the gallery as a token of our appreciation. Have a safe and wonderful weekend, and I leave you all in peace and solidarity. Thank you.